You wake up on Christmas Eve, 1891, in a city that smells like coal dust and roasted chestnuts. London. But not the London you've seen in movies. This London reeks of horse manure and industrial ambition. Gas lamps flicker on cobblestone streets like dying stars. The Thames is a chemical soup. Children sell matches on corners, their fingers black with frostbite. And somewhere in Mayfair, in a townhouse with iron gates and velvet curtains, a man is counting candles. His name is Cornelius Grimwald. Yes, that's his real name. His parents clearly hated him. Cornelius is 47 years old, unmarried, and worth approximately £3 million, which in 1891 makes him richer than God and twice as insufferable. He made his fortune in banking, specifically in lending money to people who couldn't afford to pay him back, then taking their houses. A business model so elegant, it still exists today. But Cornelius has a problem. He can't sleep. Not because of guilt. He doesn't have any. He can't sleep because of light, specifically Christmas light. Every December, the city explodes into luminous chaos. Candles in every window, gas lamps burning all night, street vendors with torches, churches lit up like cathedrals of fire, and it drives him absolutely insane. Not because it's beautiful, because it's wasteful, because every candle burning is a penny not being saved. Every gas lamp glowing is money evaporating into the night sky. Cornelius lies awake in his four-poster bed, staring at the ceiling, calculating the collective cost of London's Christmas illumination. 40,000 households, average of 12 candles per household, 480,000 candles, burning for an average of 6 hours per night. The mathematics of it makes him nauseous. He sits up, puts on his velvet robe, walks to his study. The room smells like leather and pipe tobacco and old money. He lights a single candle, just one because he's not a hypocrite, he's simply efficient, and sits at his mahogany desk. He pulls out a piece of parchment, dips his quill in ink, and begins to write. Proposal for the regulation and taxation of decorative illumination during the festive season. He writes for 3 hours. By the time dawn breaks over London, Cornelius has created the most comprehensively insane tax code in British history. A tiered system of fees based on candle size, burn duration, and decorative intent. 1 shilling per candle per night. 2 shillings for gas lamps. 5 shillings for church illuminations. 10 shillings for commercial displays. The logic is airtight. Light is a luxury. Luxuries should be taxed. Therefore, Christmas light should be taxed. It's not personal. It's just economics. And if people can't afford to celebrate Christmas with light, well, they can celebrate in the dark like their ancestors did. Tradition, after all, is just poverty with better marketing. Cornelius folds the proposal, seals it with wax, addresses it to his friend at the Treasury, a man who owes him £17,000 and will therefore approve anything Cornelius suggests. He hands it to his butler, a skeletal man named Withers, who hasn't smiled since 1873. Post this immediately, Cornelius says. Withers nods, takes the letter, disappears into the fog, and Cornelius goes to bed. Finally, he sleeps like a baby, a cold, calculating baby who dreams in spreadsheets. 3 weeks later, on a grey January morning, the London Gazette publishes a small notice on page 7. New taxation measures on festive illumination to take effect, December 1891. Most people don't notice it. They're too busy recovering from Christmas hangovers and arguing about whether Queen Victoria looks more dead than usual in her latest portrait. But a few people notice. Shopkeepers, church wardens, street vendors. And they're confused. Because taxing Christmas light isn't just unusual, it's insane. It's like taxing rain or taxing gravity. Light is light. How do you even measure it? How do you enforce it? Do tax collectors go door to door with candle inventories? Do they arrest people for over-illumination? Nobody knows. Because Cornelius didn't think that far ahead. He's a banker, not a bureaucrat. He understands money, not people. And this is where the story gets interesting, because Cornelius Grimwald, in his infinite wisdom and profound misunderstanding of human nature, has just done something extraordinary. He's accidentally invented the greatest Christmas marketing campaign in history. He's turned light into rebellion. He's made candles political. He's transformed the mundane act of decorating for Christmas into an act of defiance. And London is about to burn, not literally. Well, mostly not literally, but here's the thing about humans. Tell them they can't do something, and they'll do it twice as hard just to spite you. Tell them light is taxable, and they'll light up the entire city like a Victorian rave. Cornelius thought he was creating scarcity. He was actually creating demand. The news spreads, not through newspapers. Those are boring. Through pubs, through markets, through gossip and outrage and the sheer comic absurdity of a man trying to tax Christmas. By February, everyone in London knows about the candle tax. By March, they're making jokes about it. By April, they're planning for December. And Cornelius has no idea what he's started. He's back in his study, counting money, sipping port, reading financial reports. He's convinced he's a genius. He's convinced he's solved the problem of wasteful illumination. He's convinced that come December, London will be dark and orderly and economically efficient. He's wrong. So, catastrophically, magnificently, historically wrong. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand who Cornelius Grimwald actually is, where he came from, how a human being becomes so disconnected from joy that he tries to tax Christmas itself. Because this isn't just a story about a stupid tax, it's a story about loneliness masquerading as logic, about fear disguised as pragmatism, about a man who confused control with safety and order with happiness. And if that sounds familiar, well, maybe this story is more about you than you'd like to admit. Subscribe before the candles burn out. It gets darker from here. Cornelius Grimwald was born in 1844 in a stone cottage in Yorkshire that smelled like damp wool and disappointment. His father, Reginald Grimwald, was a minor landowner with major debts. His mother, Constance, was a woman whose dreams died so long ago she couldn't remember what they looked like. They had 3 children. Cornelius was the middle one, the forgettable one. The one they named after Constance's uncle, who died of syphilis in Dover. Christmas in the Grimwald household wasn't festive. It was transactional. Reginald believed in Victorian efficiency, meaning everything, including love, had to earn its keep. There were no decorations, no candles in the windows, no roasted goose, just cold mutton, colder silence, and the sound of Reginald's pen scratching ledgers by candlelight. 1 candle, always just 1, because 2 would be wasteful. Cornelius learned early that light was expensive. That warmth was a luxury. That joy was something other people had, people who were careless with money and therefore doomed to poverty. He learned that the world was a ledger, and you were either in the black or you were dead. He was 7 years old when he stopped believing in Christmas, not because of some dramatic event, just slow erosion. Year after year of watching other children receive gifts while he received lectures about fiscal responsibility. Year after year of walking past lit windows, seeing families laughing around fires, and being told that those people were fools who would die in debtor's prison. Reginald wasn't cruel, he was practical, and practicality applied with enough consistency becomes its own kind of cruelty. When Cornelius was 12, Reginald died. Heart attack. Slumped over his ledgers. His last words were, "Check the accounts." Cornelius did. They were in perfect order, every penny accounted for, and completely, devastatingly insufficient. Reginald had spent so much time managing money that he'd forgotten to make any. The family was broke. Constance sold the cottage, moved them to London, got a job as a seamstress in Whitechapel. The children scattered. Cornelius's older brother joined the Navy and died of dysentery in India. His younger sister married a butcher and moved to Manchester. Cornelius stayed with Constance, helped her sew, delivered finished garments to wealthy houses in Mayfair. This is where his education really began. Not in books, in doorways, standing outside townhouses waiting to be paid, watching through windows as families celebrated things he couldn't name, watching light spill from chandeliers, watching children open presents, watching people waste candles like they grew on trees. He hated them, not consciously. He told himself he pitied them, their recklessness, their ignorance of economics. But underneath the pity was rage, white-hot, justified rage, because they had something he didn't. Not money. Money he could get. They had ease, permission to be wasteful, the luxury of not counting every candle. Cornelius decided, standing in those cold doorways, that he would never be like his father, never poor, never powerless, never dependent on anyone's charity or kindness. He would master money, not serve it, and if that meant becoming the kind of person who counted candles, so be it. He was 17 when Constance died. Tuberculosis, slow and ugly. She spent her last weeks coughing blood into rags, apologizing for the cost of medicine. Cornelius held her hand, did the math, realized the medicine was useless anyway, stopped buying it, spent the money on her funeral instead. A practical choice. She died in January. He buried her in February. By March, he'd gotten a job as a clerk at a bank. This is where the story usually becomes a rags-to-riches fairy tale. Poor boy works hard, climbs the ladder, achieves success. And that's technically true. Cornelius was brilliant with numbers, ruthlessly efficient. He advanced quickly. By 25, he was a junior manager. By 30, a senior partner. By 40, he owned the bank. But here's what the fairy tale version leaves out. What it costs to become that person. The things you have to cut away, the parts of yourself you have to kill. Cornelius didn't just work hard. He deleted everything that wasn't work. Friends, distracting, romance, expensive, hobbies, wasteful. He built his life like a fortress. Efficient, impenetrable, empty. He told himself he was happy. He had everything he'd wanted. Money, power, security, a townhouse in Mayfair with iron gates and velvet curtains. He could walk past those windows now. He was inside them. He'd won. Except he hadn't, because the thing about fortresses is that they keep things out, including joy, including connection, including any reason to light a candle other than necessity. Cornelius looked at Christmas the way an alien might look at humans, with complete incomprehension. Why do they do this? Why do they spend money on decorations that will be thrown away? Why do they burn candles for beauty instead of function? Why do they waste resources on temporary happiness? He couldn't understand it. And what we can't understand, we try to control. The candle tax wasn't born from greed. It was born from fear. Fear of waste, fear of chaos, fear of the universe being fundamentally irrational. If he could tax Christmas, he could make it make sense. He could impose order on joy. He could turn celebration into something measurable, manageable, safe. He thought he was being rational. He was actually being terrified. But terror, dressed in logic, is still terror. By summer 1891, the candle tax was official. Parliament barely noticed it, a minor revenue measure buried in a budget bill. Nobody objected. Why would they? It was just candles. And Cornelius Thaddeus Grimwald was a respected banker with a reputation for sound financial thinking. If he said taxing Christmas light made sense, well, it probably did. Nobody asked the one question that mattered. What happens when you try to tax joy? London was about to find out, and Cornelius was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. You can't control what you refuse to understand. You can't manage what you've never felt. And you absolutely, catastrophically, cannot tax Christmas in Victorian London without consequences. The city was watching. The city was waiting. And the city was about to turn Cornelius's logical nightmare into the most illuminated Christmas in history. Meet Augustus Pemberton, age 52, career civil servant, Chief Inspector of Municipal Revenue Collection for the City of London. A man whose entire personality can be summarized in one sentence. He has never in his entire life questioned an order. Augustus received the Candle Tax Directive in August. A leather-bound document, 47 pages long, detailing the implementation procedures for the Taxation of Decorative Illumination Act. He read it 3 times, understood approximately none of it, and then did what every good bureaucrat does when faced with impossible instructions. He created a committee, the Committee for the Assessment and Collection of Festive Illumination Taxes. 12 men, all civil servants. all deeply committed to the principle that if something is written in official language, it must make sense. They met every Tuesday in a windowless room that smelled like mildew and broken dreams. Their first meeting lasted 6 hours. They accomplished nothing, because the tax code, while comprehensive in theory, was completely unenforceable in practice. How do you measure decorative intent? How do you distinguish between a candle lit for necessity and a candle lit for Christmas? What if someone claims their 17 candles are for reading? What if they're Jewish? What if they're lying? Augustus took notes, detailed, meticulous notes that captured the essence of their confusion. He wrote, "Clarification needed definition of decorative," and query, "Do Advent candles count?" and Pemberton suggests exemption for churches. Johnson objects, debate postponed. By meeting 7, they'd made one decision. They needed more meetings. By meeting 12, they'd created a form. The official declaration of festive illumination intent, 4 pages, 37 questions, including, do you plan to illuminate your dwelling during the festive season? If yes, for what purpose? Please list all sources of illumination by type, quantity, and duration. Sign here to acknowledge that false declarations are punishable by fine or imprisonment. Augustus was proud of the form. It was thorough, it was official, it was completely insane. And in September, he distributed it to every household in London. 300,000 forms, hand-delivered by exhausted postal workers who were starting to question their life choices. The reaction was immediate and hilarious. People thought it was a joke, a satire. A piece of performance art by someone with too much time and too much stationery. They laughed. They showed it to their neighbors. They used it as kindling. Nobody filled it out. Augustus waited. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. By October, he'd received exactly 47 completed forms. Most of them were blank. 3 were explicit drawings of body parts. 1 was a shopping list. 1 said simply, "No." Augustus panicked. Not emotionally. He hadn't felt an emotion since 1867. But professionally. Because the tax was supposed to generate revenue, and revenue requires compliance, and compliance requires enforcement, and enforcement requires what? An army of candle inspectors? Door-to-door illumination audits? Christmas police? He called an emergency committee meeting, 14 men this time. He'd added 2 more because surely more people would generate better ideas. They debated for 8 hours. They considered hiring additional staff. They considered creating an illumination registry. They considered mandatory candle licenses. And then Jenkins, a junior clerk who'd been silent until now, raised his hand and said, "Sir, what if we just don't enforce it?" Silence. Long, horrible silence. Because that question contained a truth that nobody in the room wanted to acknowledge. The tax was unenforceable. It always had been. It was bureaucratic theatre, a paper dragon, a law that existed only in documents, not in reality. Augustus stared at Jenkins. Jenkins stared back. And for the first time in his career, Augustus Pemberton understood that his job was meaningless. But he couldn't admit that, because admitting that would require questioning authority. And questioning authority leads to chaos, and chaos leads to anarchy, and anarchy leads to people lighting candles without permission. And then where would we be? So Augustus did what bureaucrats always do when faced with the impossible. He wrote a report. Progress update on the implementation of decorative illumination taxation. 23 pages, charts, graphs, projections, all demonstrating that while implementation had faced minor challenges, the program was fundamentally sound and would generate substantial revenue once compliance mechanisms were optimized. He sent it to the Treasury. They filed it. Nobody read it. And in his townhouse in Mayfair, Cornelius Grimwald read the report and smiled, because the numbers looked good. On paper, in theory, in the abstract mathematical realm where he lived, he had no idea that in the real world, in the streets and pubs and churches of London, something else was happening. Something he couldn't control, something he couldn't tax. A movement was forming, not organized, not official, Just organic human rebellion. People were talking, laughing, planning, because the candle tax had done something extraordinary. It had made Christmas cool. Suddenly lighting candles wasn't just tradition. It was resistance. It was punk rock. It was the most Victorian thing you could do. You weren't just celebrating Christmas. You were fighting the man. You were standing up to government overreach. You were defending your right to waste candles on beauty. And waste them they would. By November, shops were selling candles at record rates. Chandlers couldn't keep stock. Factories were working overtime. The market was flooded with cheap tallow candles, expensive beeswax candles, imported French candles, novelty candles shaped like baby Jesus. Churches announced they would light every candle they owned. Hotels advertised fully illuminated Christmas experiences. Street vendors started selling torches, legitimate torches, for walking around at night, for no reason except that it looked cool and probably annoyed Cornelius Grimwald. The newspapers picked up the story. Not the serious ones. They were boring. The tabloids, the satirical magazines. Punch ran a cartoon of Scrooge counting candles while ghosts set his ledgers on fire. The Illustrated London News published an editorial titled, "On the Fundamental Human Right to Festive Illumination." Even Queen Victoria's staff leaked a rumour that Her Majesty thought the tax was tiresome. And Augustus Pemberton sat in his office, surrounded by unfilled forms and unrealised revenue projections, and realised that he'd been tasked with enforcing the unenforceable. He was the candle tax's only believer. Everyone else thought it was a joke. Everyone except Cornelius. Cornelius read the newspapers, saw the cartoons, heard the gossip, and instead of backing down, he doubled down. Because that's what fear does. It makes you rigid. It makes you hold tighter to the thing that's failing. It makes you believe that if you just explain the logic one more time, people will understand. He wrote letters to the newspapers, long, detailed letters explaining the economic necessity of the candle tax, the waste, the inefficiency, the moral hazard of unchecked illumination. He used words like fiscal responsibility and sustainable resource management. He genuinely believed he was making sense. The newspapers published his letters in their comedy sections. And London kept buying candles. More candles. So many candles that the price started dropping because supply couldn't keep up with demand, which meant people bought even more candles, which meant the market became more efficient, which meant Cornelius's tax was having the exact opposite effect he'd intended. He'd tried to create scarcity. He'd created abundance. He'd tried to impose order. He'd created chaos. He'd tried to tax Christmas, and he'd accidentally made it more popular than ever. November ended. December began. And London started to glow, not slowly, all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. Every window, every door, every church, every shop, candles everywhere, gas lamps burning all night, street vendors with torches, children carrying lanterns. The city looked like it was on fire, but it wasn't burning. It was celebrating. And in his dark townhouse, surrounded by ledgers and loneliness, Cornelius Grimwald stared out his window at the impossible, glowing city and realized something terrible. He'd lost. Not just the tax. Everything. The argument, the logic, the control, all of it. London didn't care about his reasons, didn't care about his mathematics, didn't care about efficiency or waste or any of the things he'd built his life around. They cared about light, about beauty, about the completely irrational, economically unsound, magnificently human decision to burn candles for no reason, except that it makes the darkness less dark. And Cornelius, alone in his perfect fortress, finally understood what he'd lost by winning, what he'd sacrificed for safety, what he'd traded for control. He'd lost Christmas, not the holiday, the feeling, the permission to be wasteful, the luxury of joy. And you can't tax your way back to that. Her name was Margaret Whitmore. 43 years old, widow, seamstress, mother of 4, living in a 2-room flat in Southwark that smelled like boiled cabbage and industrial ambition. Margaret was not political. She was not wealthy. She was not particularly interested in taxes or bureaucracy or Cornelius Grimwald's opinions about illumination efficiency. But Margaret had opinions of her own. Specifically, she believed that if the government wanted to tax her Christmas candles, they could come take them from her cold, dead, slightly arthritic hands. Margaret heard about the candle tax in October from a neighbour, who heard it from a shopkeeper, who read it in a newspaper used to wrap fish. The information arrived garbled and incomplete, which made it sound even more absurd than it actually was. A tax on candles? On Christmas? Was this real? Was the government actually that stupid? Margaret didn't know. She also didn't care. Because whether the tax was real or not, the rumour of it had accomplished something remarkable. It had pissed her off. Margaret had been lighting candles for Christmas since she was 6 years old, in her parents' cottage in Kent, in her first flat in London, in the house she'd shared with Thomas before the cholera took him. Candles weren't luxury. They were memory. They were continuity. They were the thing that made December bearable, when winter was trying to kill you and your children needed to believe that light would return. You don't tax that. You don't measure that. You don't put that on a form and send it to a civil servant named Augustus who's never felt joy in his life. So Margaret decided to do something. Not something organized. Not something revolutionary. Just something small and petty and magnificently human. She decided to light every candle she owned. All of them. At once. On Christmas Eve. In her window, where everyone could see. She told her neighbors, her friends, the women at the market. The idea spread like cholera, but more festive. Not through planning. Through gossip. Through the inherent appeal of a collective middle finger to authority. By late November, half of Southwark was planning to do the same thing. Light everything. Every candle. Every lamp. Every scrap of wick and wax they could afford. Turn the entire neighbourhood into a bonfire of defiance. The beauty of it was that it wasn't technically illegal. The tax hadn't been enforced. No inspectors had shown up. No fines had been issued. So technically they were just celebrating Christmas. Very, very aggressively. Margaret started buying candles in November. Not many. She wasn't rich. Just 1 or 2 extra per week. By December she had 47 candles. More than she'd ever owned in her life. She arranged them in her window, on the sill, on small dishes, on pieces of wood her eldest son had sanded smooth. Her children watched with confused delight. "Mum, that's a lot of candles." "I know. Are we celebrating something special?" "We're celebrating being alive," which was true. But also, they were celebrating something else, something harder to name. The right to be wasteful, the right to burn things just because they're beautiful. The right to tell Cornelius Grimwald and his calculator brain that some things don't belong on ledgers. December 20th. 1 week until Christmas. Margaret heard from her neighbour that churches were planning to light up too. Not just the usual Christmas candles, everything, every chandelier, every votive, every bit of wax and oil they'd been saving. A coordinated illumination across all of London. The priests weren't stupid. They knew about the tax. They also knew that taxing Christmas light was political suicide. And they were willing to bet that the government wouldn't enforce a tax that made them look like villains in a Dickens novel. They were right. Augustus Pemberton received reports of the planned illuminations. He sent letters requesting compliance with the decorative illumination tax. The churches sent polite responses that roughly translated to, "Respectfully, go to hell." Augustus filed the responses, wrote another report. Did nothing. Because what could he do? Arrest priests on Christmas? For lighting candles? The optics were catastrophic. The logic was sound, but the optics were catastrophic. And in politics, optics always win. Margaret didn't know about the political calculations. She just knew that by December 23rd, her entire neighbourhood was buzzing with anticipation. Not because of presents, not because of food, because of fire. Because they were about to do something stupid and beautiful and completely unnecessary. On Christmas Eve, Margaret woke up at dawn, made breakfast, sent her children to fetch water from the pump, cleaned the flat, cooked dinner, did all the normal things. But underneath the routine was electricity, anticipation, the feeling you get before you do something that might be brilliant or might be a disaster, but will definitely be memorable. At 4 o'clock, the sun started setting. London in December gets dark fast. By 5 o'clock, the sky was black, and the city started to glow, not all at once, gradually, like a wave, starting in the East End, spreading west, window after window, lighting up. Not just 1 or 2 candles, dozens, every household with more candles than they'd ever burned before. People who couldn't afford dinner lighting candles like they were made of money. Margaret lit her first candle at 5:30. Then another, then another. Her children helped. They made a game of it. 47 candles. It took 20 minutes. When they finished, the room was bright as noon, bright as summer, bright as defiance. Outside, the street was glowing. Every window, every door, every available surface covered in flickering light. It looked insane, it looked dangerous. It looked like Christmas had gone feral and decided to burn down the city from pure joy. Margaret opened her window. Cold air rushed in. She didn't care. She wanted to see. Wanted to be part of it. Wanted to watch London tell Cornelius Grimwald exactly what they thought of his tax. Her neighbours were leaning out of windows too, laughing, shouting to each other, pointing at buildings across the street where people had lit so many candles it looked like the place was on fire. Nobody was scared. Everyone was delighted. Because they'd done it. They'd turned Christmas into a protest. They'd made light political. And then the church bells started ringing. All of them, at once. Every church in London announcing that they too were lighting up. And they were. Margaret could see St. George's from her window, every window blazing, the stained glass glowing like jewels. It looked like heaven had decided to relocate to Southwark. By 8 o'clock, all of London was burning. Not literally. Mostly not literally. There were some small fires, candles tipped over, curtains singed, but nothing catastrophic. Just enough chaos to make it exciting. The streets filled with people, not going anywhere, just walking, looking, experiencing the absurd beauty of a city that had collectively decided to waste candles on principle. Children ran with lanterns, couples walked arm in arm, pointing at particularly extravagant displays. Street vendors sold hot chestnuts and terrible wine, and probably some illegal torches. It was the most beautiful, ridiculous, economically irrational thing London had ever done, and it felt like rebellion, like victory. Like proof that humans, when pushed, will always choose beauty over efficiency. Margaret stood at her window, surrounded by her 47 candles, watching her city glow. Her children pressed against her sides. Her eldest daughter asked, "Mum, why are we doing this?" And Margaret smiled, a real smile. The kind she hadn't felt since Thomas died. And she said, "Because some things are worth burning for," which sounds dramatic. But in that moment, in that glowing city, surrounded by stupid, wasteful, magnificent light, it was true. Cornelius Grimwald saw it too, from his window in Mayfair. He watched his ordered, efficient city transform into chaos, watched his tax become a joke, watched his logic get drowned in candlelight, and something in him broke, or maybe something in him healed. It's hard to tell. Sometimes they look the same. If you'd stood on London Bridge at 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve 1891, you would have seen something impossible. A city on fire, not dying, celebrating, the Thames reflecting 1,000 windows, each window reflecting 100 candles. The math doesn't work, the physics doesn't work, but the beauty works, and sometimes that's enough. Cornelius Grimwald stood on that bridge, not because he wanted to, because he couldn't stay in his townhouse anymore. The darkness inside had become unbearable now that he could see what light looked like. Real light, not the single efficient candle he allowed himself, but wasteful, stupid, glorious excess. He'd left his house at 8, without planning to, without a coat, just walked out his front door and into the glowing streets. His butler, Withers, had asked if he needed anything. Cornelius didn't answer. He just walked. Mayfair was bright, every wealthy house competing to out-illuminate their neighbours. Chandeliers visible through windows, gas lamps turned to maximum. One particularly ambitious household had strung lanterns across their garden. It looked like a fairy tale, or a fire hazard? Probably both. Cornelius walked south, toward the river, past Hyde Park, past Westminster. The streets were full of people, families, couples, drunk men singing carols, children with faces sticky from cheap candy. Everyone moving slowly, hypnotized by light. Nobody recognized him. Why would they? He was just another man in dark clothes walking alone on Christmas Eve, invisible, which is what he'd always wanted. Until now. Now invisibility felt less like safety and more like erasure. He reached the bridge, stopped in the middle, looked east toward the tower, looked west toward Parliament, both directions glowing. The city looked like it was being consumed by stars. And Cornelius, for the first time in decades, felt something that wasn't calculation. Wonder. Tiny and uncomfortable and absolutely terrifying, because wonder doesn't fit on ledgers. You can't measure it, you can't tax it, you can't control it. It just exists. Wasteful and irrational and completely, devastatingly human. Behind him someone laughed. A woman. He turned, saw a family on the bridge. Mother, father, 3 children. The youngest child holding a candle in a small lantern, the light catching her face, making her look like she'd been painted by someone who believed in heaven. The mother saw Cornelius watching, smiled, not friendly, just acknowledging his existence. "Merry Christmas," she said. Cornelius nodded, tried to speak. Couldn't. Because what do you say when you've just realized you've been wrong about everything? When you've built your entire life on a foundation of fear disguised as logic? When you've spent 47 years counting candles and forgotten why people light them? The family moved on, walked towards Southwark, their daughter's lantern bobbing. A small light in an ocean of lights. Cornelius stayed on the bridge, watched the river, watched the reflections, and slowly, painfully, like thawing after frostbite, he started to understand what he'd done. Not the tax. The tax was stupid but forgivable. What he'd done was worse. He'd tried to eliminate waste, and in doing so he'd eliminated meaning, because waste is meaning, excess is meaning. The irrational decision to burn candles you can't afford, for beauty you can't quantify, for no reason except that it makes the darkness less dark. That's meaning. He'd spent his life trying to be efficient, and efficiency is the enemy of joy. Somewhere in the city, Margaret Whitmore was still at her window, still surrounded by 47 candles. Her children had fallen asleep. Her neighbors had finally stopped shouting, but the candles kept burning, because that's what candles do. They burn until they're gone. They don't ask permission. They don't check if it's economical. They just give light until they can't anymore. Margaret thought about Thomas, her dead husband, who'd been terrible with money, who'd bought her flowers they couldn't afford, who'd lit extra candles on her birthday, even when they were behind on rent, who'd understood something she was only now articulating. You can't save your way to happiness. She missed him, viscerally. The kind of missing that feels like amputation. But watching the city burn for no reason except beauty, she felt something else too. Gratitude. That she'd had someone who knew how to waste money on love, who knew that some expenses aren't expenses at all. They're investments in not dying inside. She blew out one candle, then another, slowly, ritually, like putting children to bed. The room dimmed. The street outside still glowed. London wasn't ready to sleep yet. London was drunk on light and rebellion, and the simple pleasure of telling a rich man he couldn't control Christmas. Across the city, Augustus Pemberton sat in his office, alone, on Christmas Eve. Because where else would he be? He'd received 47 emergency reports about unregulated illumination. 47. The number felt cosmically ironic. He wrote responses to exactly none of them. Instead, he stared at his form. The official declaration of festive illumination intent. 4 pages. 37 questions, thousands of hours of committee work. And not one person had complied. Not one. Augustus had spent his entire career believing that rules mattered, that order mattered, that if you just created the right forms and followed the right procedures, society would function. And maybe that was true for sewage systems and postal routes. But it wasn't true for Christmas. Christmas didn't care about his forms. Christmas lit candles and laughed at him. He felt something unfamiliar. Not quite emotion, more like the memory of emotion. The ghost of what feeling might have been like before he became a bureaucrat. And he realized, with the slow horror of someone waking from a coma, that he'd been asleep for 30 years. He stood up, put on his coat, walked out of his office, down the stairs, into the street, into the glowing chaos of London on Christmas Eve. And for the first time since 1867, Augustus Pemberton felt something. It wasn't happiness. And it was more complicated than happiness. It was the recognition that he'd missed everything that mattered while counting things that didn't, that he'd spent decades enforcing rules about life without actually living, that he'd become a form, a procedure, a man-shaped piece of paperwork. He walked, no destination, just movement, past churches blazing with light, past pubs overflowing with drunk, happy people, past families singing carols off-key, past everything he'd avoided by staying in his office, and he started to cry, quietly, efficiently, the way bureaucrats cry, not because he was sad, because he was thawing, and thawing hurts worse than freezing. Freezing is numb. Thawing is feeling returning to dead tissue. It's excruciating and necessary, and the only way back to being human. Meanwhile, in Mayfair, Cornelius's townhouse stood dark, the only dark building on a bright street. Withers had given up waiting, had lit one candle in the kitchen, just one, because that's what Cornelius would want, efficiency even in absence. But Cornelius wasn't there to want anything. He was still on the bridge, still watching, still trying to understand how he'd become the villain in his own story, how he'd confused fear with wisdom, how he'd built a fortress so effective it had trapped him inside. A church bell chimed. 10 o'clock. The crowds were thinning, people heading home, children being carried by tired parents, couples walking slowly, reluctant for the night to end. The magic was fading, not gone, just settling, like snow after a storm. Cornelius turned, walked back toward Mayfair, but slowly, looking at windows, looking at families, looking at the evidence of a world that had rejected his logic and thrived anyway. And with each step, the fortress cracked a little more. By the time he reached his street, it was almost midnight. His house was still dark, still perfect, still completely, devastatingly empty. He stood outside his own front door and couldn't make himself go in, because going in meant returning to the life he'd built, the life that made sense on paper and felt like death in practice. So he didn't go in. He kept walking, past his house, past his neighbors' houses with their inappropriate illumination, past the end of his street, into Hyde Park, where the trees were bare and the grass was frozen and the darkness was absolute. He sat on a bench. Cold seeped through his clothes. He didn't care, because cold was feeling, and feeling, even terrible feeling, was better than the nothing he'd been living in. Above him, stars, thousands of them, burning, wasting energy, lighting nothing, just existing, just being beautiful for no reason, the ultimate inefficiency. And Cornelius, looking up at that wasteful cosmos, finally understood. Light isn't for seeing. Light is for being seen, for saying, I'm here, I exist, I matter. For marking time and space and the stubborn human refusal to disappear into darkness. You can't tax that. You can't control that. You can only participate or stand outside watching, alone and right and completely, devastatingly wrong. Cornelius sat in the dark park until dawn, watching the stars burn, watching the night end, watching his old life dissolve like sugar in water. And when the sun rose on Christmas morning, cold and pale and indifferent, he stood up, walked home, opened his door, and looked at his perfect empty townhouse with new eyes. Everything was wrong. The furniture, the silence, the single candle in its silver holder, all of it wrong. All of it a monument to fear pretending to be wisdom. He walked to his study, opened his desk, found the original proposal, the The taxation of decorative illumination. Read it again. And this time, instead of pride, he felt shame. Not because the logic was wrong. The logic was perfect. That was the problem. Perfect logic applied to human joy creates monstrosities. He took the proposal, walked to his fireplace and burned it. Not dramatically, just practically. Because it was trash, and trash belongs in fire. And then he burned his copies, his notes, his calculations. All of it. Until nothing remained but ash and the faint smell of burned paper. Withers appeared in the doorway. "Sir, is everything all right?" Cornelius looked at his butler. Really looked. Saw a man who hadn't smiled in decades. A man who'd become an extension of Cornelius's efficiency. A man who'd forgotten how to exist outside of service. "Withers, take the day off." "Sir? Go home, see your family, light candles, do something wasteful." Withers stared, confused, concerned. "Sir, I don't have family." Of course he didn't, because Cornelius had hired him specifically because he had no attachments, no distractions, perfect efficiency, perfect emptiness. Then go to a pub, get drunk, sing carols. Do something you'll regret. "Sir, are you feeling well?" "No, Withers, I'm not. I haven't felt well in 30 years, but I'm starting to feel something, and that's progress." Withers left, slowly, uncertainly, like a prisoner who'd forgotten what freedom looked like. And Cornelius sat in his study surrounded by ash and made a decision. He couldn't undo the tax. It was law now, but he could write to Parliament, could admit he'd been wrong, could ask them to repeal it. Could publicly acknowledge that some things shouldn't be measured. He pulled out fresh paper, dipped his pen, and started writing, not a proposal, an apology, to London, to Christmas, to every person who'd ever lit a candle for no reason except that darkness is terrible and light is hope, and sometimes that's enough. The letter was 3 pages long. He signed it, sealed it, and knew that sending it would destroy his reputation. The great Cornelius Thaddeus Grimwald, admitting he was wrong. The banker who understood money better than anyone, confessing he'd misunderstood everything else. He didn't care, or rather he cared about something more, about being human instead of right, about participating in the wasteful, beautiful chaos of existence instead of watching from his fortress. He sent the letter on December 26th. Parliament received it on December 27th. They debated for 3 days. And on December 30th, 1891, the Taxation of Decorative Illumination Act was repealed, not because of Cornelius's apology, because the tax had been unenforceable from the start, because London had called their bluff, because you can't tax joy without looking like a monster. But Cornelius's letter was published in the Times, and people read it, and some laughed, and some felt something like sympathy, because everyone understood what it meant to be so scared of waste that you forgot how to live. January 1892, London without Christmas light, back to normal, gas lamps burning at regulated intervals, candles lit for necessity, not defiance, the rebellion over, the city returning to its usual grey efficiency. And in a townhouse in Mayfair, a man trying to figure out what happens after you dismantle your entire identity. Cornelius woke up on January 3rd and realized he didn't know what to do. For 47 years he'd had purpose: count money, maximize efficiency, control variables, eliminate waste. Those directives had filled every hour of every day, and now they were gone, burned in his fireplace along with his proposal. He went to his bank, sat at his desk, looked at ledgers. Numbers that used to make perfect sense now looked like alien language, meaningless. He understood them intellectually, but couldn't connect them to anything that mattered. These weren't representing human lives, they were just numbers. His partners noticed. "Grimwald, you seem distracted." He was. By the window, by the people walking past, by the shopkeeper across the street arranging his display, by the sheer, overwhelming complexity of life happening outside his calculations. How had he never noticed this before? How had he reduced all of this chaos and beauty and terrible, magnificent humanity, to columns in a ledger? "I'm fine," he lied. just tired. But he wasn't tired. He was awake, painfully, overwhelmingly awake, like someone who'd been living in a dark room for decades and suddenly stepped into sunlight. Everything was too bright, too much, too real. He made mistakes, added wrong, forgot meetings, gave a loan to someone who clearly couldn't pay it back because the man reminded him of his father, and Cornelius felt something like pity, which was new and uncomfortable and completely unprofessional. His partners called a meeting. "Grimwald, perhaps you should take time off, rest, recover from the incident." They meant the candle tax, the public humiliation, the letter in the Times. They were being polite. What they really meant was, "You've become a liability. You've stopped making sense. You've stopped being the machine we hired." Cornelius almost argued, almost explained that he wasn't broken, he was healing, that what looked like decline was actually growth, that he was finally, terrifyingly, becoming human. But he didn't, because they wouldn't understand, because you can't explain color to people who've only ever seen in black and white, because some transformations look like death from the outside. "You're right," he said. "I'll take time." He left the bank on January 7th, walked home through streets that looked different now, sharper, more detailed. He noticed things: a child's dropped mitten in the snow, a woman selling flowers that wouldn't last the day, a man playing violin badly but with enthusiasm, small inefficient moments that added up to something he couldn't name. At home, Withers was different too, less skeletal, more human. He'd taken Cornelius's advice, had gotten drunk on Christmas, had sung carols, had woken up with a hangover and a memory of laughing, and something in him had shifted. "Sir, there's a letter for you." Cornelius took it, plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a single page, handwritten, messy. "Dear Mr. Grimwald, you don't know me. I'm nobody important. Just a seamstress in Southwark who lit too many candles on Christmas. I read your letter in the Times, about being wrong, about being scared, and I wanted to say thank you. Not for the tax, that was stupid, but for the apology, for admitting you're human. Most rich people never do that. They just stay wrong forever. You stayed wrong for 47 years, but at least you stopped. That takes courage. Or stupidity. Probably both. Anyway, thank you. Merry late Christmas, Margaret Whitmore." Cornelius read it 3 times, felt something in his chest that might have been emotion or might have been indigestion, but felt important either way. Someone had written to him, not about money, not about business, about being human, about making mistakes and admitting them and that being enough. He wanted to write back. But what would he say? "Thank you for lighting candles. Thank you for teaching me that efficiency isn't virtue. Thank you for existing loudly enough that I couldn't ignore you." He put the letter in his desk drawer, next to where the proposal used to be. A different kind of document, one that represented connection instead of control. Over the next weeks, more letters arrived. Not many. 7 total. From people who'd read his apology. People who'd been hurt by his banks. People who'd lost houses to his loans. People who had every reason to hate him. And most of them did. But some, just some, wrote to say they understood. That fear makes people cruel. That realizing it doesn't erase the cruelty, but at least stops it from multiplying. One letter was from Augustus Pemberton. "Dear Mr. Grimwald, I implemented your tax. Spent 4 months creating forms nobody filled out. Held meetings that accomplished nothing. And on Christmas Eve I watched the city ignore everything I'd built, and I realized my entire career has been meaningless. Not just the candle tax. Everything. I've been enforcing rules about life without living. I'm resigning from the civil service. I don't know what I'll do instead, but it has to be something real, something that matters. Thank you for being wrong loudly enough that I could recognize myself. Augustus." Cornelius folded the letter carefully, put it with the others. A collection of confessions, a support group for people who'd mistaken control for safety. He started walking. Every day, not to anywhere, just walking. Through neighborhoods he'd never visited, past buildings he'd financed but never seen, into the actual physical world that existed outside his ledgers, He walked through Whitechapel, saw the poverty his banks had enabled, not caused. He wasn't that powerful, but enabled, by making loans that trapped people, by foreclosing efficiently, by treating human suffering as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of profit. He walked through Southwark, saw Margaret's building, didn't knock, just looked, wondered which window had held 47 candles, wondered what kind of person lights that many candles on principle, wondered if he'd ever been that alive. He walked through the East End, saw children selling matches, saw women working, saw men drinking away wages they couldn't afford to lose, saw the machinery of poverty grinding people into dust, and realized he'd been part of that machinery, a well-oiled, efficient cog. The walks exhausted him, not physically, emotionally. Because seeing is exhausting when you've been blind. Because recognizing your complicity in suffering is exhausting. Because being human is exhausting in ways that being a calculator never was. But he kept walking. Because what else was there? He couldn't go back to the bank. Couldn't go back to counting money like it mattered more than people. Couldn't unknow what he now knew, that efficiency without compassion is just cruelty with better math. On January 23rd, he walked past a church, St. Mary's in Lambeth. The door was open. He hadn't been in a church since his mother's funeral, didn't believe in God, didn't believe in anything except numbers, or at least he hadn't. He went inside. Cold stone, stained glass, smell of old incense and older prayers. Empty except for an old woman lighting candles, not for Christmas, just because darkness is terrible and light is hope, and some rituals transcend reason. Cornelius sat in a pew, watched her light candles, 1, 2, 3, each one a small rebellion against entropy, against the universe's tendency toward cold and dark, against the very reasonable, very logical fact that everything dies and nothing matters. Except it does matter. Somehow, in ways he couldn't calculate. The candles mattered. The woman mattered. The act of fighting darkness with wax and wick and human stubbornness mattered. The woman finished, saw Cornelius watching. "You need to light one." "I don't know how." She laughed, not cruelly, like he'd made a joke. "You take a candle, you light it. You say whatever needs saying, that's how." "What if I don't know what to say?" "Then you say nothing. The light speaks." She left. Cornelius sat in the cold church, looking at candles, thinking about everything he'd wasted by refusing to waste anything, thinking about his mother, his father, his siblings scattered and dead, his 47 years of perfect efficiency that had added up to perfect emptiness. He stood up, walked to the candles, took one, lit it from another. The flame caught, grew, steady and warm and completely irrational. He didn't pray, didn't know how, just stood there, holding light, feeling stupid, feeling human. Feeling like maybe, possibly, if he was very lucky and very persistent, he might eventually figure out how to live instead of just exist. He put the candle down, left a shilling in the donation box, walked out into grey January light, and for the first time in decades felt something like peace, not happiness. Peace is different. Happiness is a peak. Peace is finally stopping climbing. Finally accepting that you're lost and tired and wrong about everything, and that's okay because everyone else is too. Cornelius walked home, made a decision. He would sell his shares in the bank. Not out of guilt. Guilt was too simple. Out of recognition that he couldn't do that work anymore, couldn't reduce lives to numbers, couldn't pretend that efficiency was virtue. He would keep enough money to live. Give the rest away, not dramatically, not publicly, just quietly. To people Margaret's letters had mentioned, to causes that made no economic sense, to the irrational human project of making darkness less dark. And then he would figure out how to be human, how to waste time, how to light candles for no reason, how to participate in the beautiful, terrible chaos of existence instead of watching from his fortress. It wouldn't be easy. You can't unlearn 47 years of fear overnight. But you can start. You can take one step, Light one candle. Make one irrational choice in favor of beauty over efficiency, and maybe that's enough. Maybe reformation isn't dramatic. Maybe it's just lighting candles until the fortress crumbles and you're finally, terrifyingly free. February arrived. Still cold, still grey. But something had shifted in the city's mood. Not obviously. London doesn't do obvious. But there was a lightness, a memory of rebellion. People who'd lit candles in December remembered what it felt like to defy logic. And some of them decided to keep defying it. Margaret Whitmore was one of them. She'd returned to normal life, sewing, raising children, counting pennies. But something had changed. She'd lit 47 candles, and the world hadn't ended. She'd wasted money on beauty and survived. And that knowledge that you can be wasteful and not die was revolutionary. She started small, bought flowers, not for any occasion. Just because the market had tulips and they were yellow and yellow was better than grey. Her children were confused. "Mum, why did you buy flowers? Nobody died." "Nobody died yet. I'm celebrating early." It was a joke, but also not. Because celebrating nothing is subversive. Celebrating survival is subversive. Celebrating the fact that you made it through another winter without dying of cholera or poverty or despair, that's the most subversive thing you can do. She put the tulips in a jar on the windowsill. They lasted 4 days. Completely impractical, completely worth it. Her neighbour noticed. "Margaret, you've got flowers." "I do." "Special occasion?" "I'm alive. That's special enough." The neighbour laughed. But she bought flowers the next week, and her neighbour bought flowers, and slowly, without planning, without organisation, a small rebellion of beauty started spreading through Southwark. Women buying flowers they couldn't afford. Men buying beer for friends. Children getting penny candy. Small, wasteful acts of defiance against the logic that said, you only spend money on survival. Margaret didn't think of it as philosophy. She thought of it as spite. Spite toward Cornelius Grimwald and his candle tax. Spite toward the universe that had taken Thomas. Spite toward poverty and winter and the general unfairness of existence. She was spending money poorly, and she was doing it on purpose, and it felt like victory. Meanwhile, Cornelius was learning the same lesson from the opposite direction. He'd sold his bank shares, kept enough to live comfortably. He wasn't stupid. But the rest, almost £2 million, he was giving away. And discovering that giving away money is harder than making it. Because you can't just hand people cash. That doesn't work. They're suspicious. They think it's a trick. They think you want something. And maybe he did. Not their gratitude, just their existence. Their proof that life could be something other than calculations. He hired someone to help. Not an accountant, a social worker, a woman named Eleanor Price who'd spent 20 years helping the poor and had very strong opinions about rich men with guilty consciences. "Mr. Grimwald, why are you doing this?" "Because I was wrong." "About what?" "Everything." She studied him. Hard eyes, seen too much suffering to trust easily. Being wrong doesn't usually make people give away millions. "I'm not giving it away, I'm redistributing inefficiency." "You're what?" "I spent my life trying to eliminate waste. Now I'm trying to create it. Deliberately. I want to give people permission to be wasteful. To buy flowers. To light candles. To make choices that don't maximize utility." Eleanor stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "You want to give people money? To waste?" "Yes. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I know. I love it. Let's start immediately." They started with Margaret. Cornelius insisted. Because she'd written to him. Because she'd lit 47 candles. Because she represented everything he'd tried to control and failed to understand. Eleanor went to Southwark, knocked on Margaret's door. Margaret answered, suspicious. Nobody visits seamstresses unless they need sewing or they're debt collectors, and Eleanor looked too well dressed to need sewing. "Mrs. Whitmore?" "Yes." "My name is Eleanor Price. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Cornelius Grimwald." Margaret's face hardened. "I don't owe him money. I know. He owes you." "What?" Eleanor explained. Cornelius was giving away money, specifically to people who'd lit excessive candles on Christmas, as reparation for the tax, as acknowledgement that he'd been wrong, as a completely irrational gesture that made no economic sense. Margaret let her in. They sat at the small table. Eleanor laid out papers. He's offering you £100, no strings, no repayment. No conditions, you can refuse, but he hopes you won't. £100. Margaret's hands shook. That was everything. A year's rent, new shoes for the children, medicine if someone got sick, security, safety, the thing she'd been chasing since Thomas died. Why? Because you lit 47 candles. That's not a reason. It is to him. Margaret looked at the papers, at Eleanor, at the yellow tulips dying on her windowsill, and made a choice that was either brilliant or insane. I'll take it, on one condition. What? He has to visit, here, see where the 47 candles burned, see what £100 means to someone who counts pennies. Eleanor smiled. I'll tell him. Cornelius came the next week, nervous. He'd never been to Southwark except on his walks. Never been inside a building like Margaret's. 2 rooms, cold, smell of cabbage and damp. Children everywhere. A life measured in small economies. Margaret made tea. Weak, because tea was expensive. They sat at the table. Awkward silence. 2 people from different worlds with nothing in common except 47 candles and a mutual recognition that they'd both been wrong about something. Thank you for coming, Margaret said. Thank you for the letter. Thank you for the money. You're welcome, though it's inadequate. It's a fortune. It's a rounding error. Margaret laughed, hard. That's the problem with you rich people. You don't know what money means. I'm learning. Good. Want to know what I'm going to do with it? Please. I'm going to waste some of it on purpose. I'm going to buy my children good shoes. I'm going to buy meat twice a week. I'm going to buy candles, lots of candles, and burn them for no reason except that they're pretty. I'm going to be deliberately, obnoxiously inefficient with your money, because that's what you need to see. That waste isn't always waste. Sometimes it's joy. Cornelius felt his eyes water, not crying, just something. That's perfect. What? That's exactly what I hoped you'd do. They talked for 2 hours. About Thomas, about Cornelius's parents, about poverty and fear, and the ways people protect themselves by building walls, about Christmas and candles, and the absurd beauty of fighting darkness with wax. When Cornelius left, he felt lighter, not happy, but less alone, because Margaret understood something he was just learning, that being human is inefficient, that love is wasteful, that the best things in life, the things that make survival worthwhile, don't fit on ledgers. Over the next months, he visited more people, dozens of them, people Eleanor had identified, people who'd lit candles, people who needed money, people who needed permission. He gave them both. Money and permission. Permission to be wasteful. Permission to buy flowers and candles and beer and candy. Permission to make choices that didn't maximize survival, but did maximize living. And something strange happened. The more money he gave away, the richer he felt. Not financially, existentially, because giving money away was connection, was participation, was proof that he existed in relation to other people instead of in opposition to them. The bank partners thought he'd gone insane. His neighbors thought he'd had a breakdown. The newspapers ran stories. Former banking magnate turns philanthropist, and the redemption of Cornelius Grimwald, and from Scrooge to Santa, a Christmas conversion. Cornelius hated the stories. They made it sound like he'd learned a lesson, like he'd become good. But he hadn't. He'd just become less terrified, less convinced that control was safety, less invested in being right. He still made mistakes, still calculated. Still occasionally caught himself counting candles and had to consciously stop. But he was trying, and trying was progress. And progress was enough. By May, he'd given away over £1 million. Direct grants, no applications, no means testing, just Eleanor identifying people who needed help and Cornelius writing checks. It was inefficient. It was imperfect. Some people wasted it. Some people used it wisely. Most people used it to survive a little easier. And that was enough. He kept £200,000, enough to live comfortably, enough to keep taking his walks, enough to keep buying his own candles, because he'd learned something important. You can't give away what you don't have. You can't be generous from poverty. You need enough security to risk being wasteful. It was a balance between calculation and chaos, between efficiency and excess, between surviving and living. And Cornelius was learning, slowly and badly and beautifully, how to walk that line. He'd never be normal, never be spontaneous, never be the kind of person who lit 47 candles without counting them, but he could be someone who understood why other people did, someone who supported that impulse instead of taxing it, someone who chose connection over control. And that was enough. That was progress. That was the beginning of being human instead of being a calculator with a heartbeat. June 1892, London in summer, warm, almost pleasant. The kind of weather that makes you forget winter exists, makes you forget that 6 months ago the city was burning with candles and rebellion, makes you forget everything except the immediate sensation of sun on skin and the smell of the Thames in heat, which is terrible, but at least it's warm. Cornelius had settled into a routine. Wake at 7, breakfast, walk, no destination, just movement through the city he'd lived in for 40 years without really seeing. Then home. Correspondence with Eleanor about where money should go. Tea, reading, more walking, dinner, sleep. A life without purpose except the purpose of existing less terribly than before. It should have felt empty. It didn't. Or rather, it felt empty in a different way. Less like a void and more like space. Room to think, room to feel, room to make mistakes without those mistakes destroying everything. He was learning that boredom is a privilege. That having nothing to do means you're not fighting for survival. That empty time is the canvas on which you paint meaning, or don't. Both are valid. He started visiting Margaret regularly. Once a week, Tuesday afternoons, they'd have tea, talk about nothing. She'd tell him about her children. He'd tell her about the people Eleanor was helping. They'd sit in comfortable silence, two people who'd accidentally become friends by lighting candles and writing letters. Margaret's children were confused by him. "Mum, why does the rich man visit?" "Because he's learning how to be human." "Is he stupid?" "Very. But he's trying." The children accepted this. Children accept everything if you say it with confidence. They started performing for him. The youngest would dance, the middle child would recite poems badly, the eldest would ask questions about money that Cornelius couldn't answer because they were too smart and too accurate. "Sir, if you have so much money, why doesn't everyone have money?" "Because the system is designed to concentrate wealth." "That seems unfair." "It is." "Why don't people change it?" "Because the people who could change it benefit from it staying the same." "Are you one of those people?" "I was." "Are you still?" Cornelius thought about it. Honest thought. "Yes. I'm still benefiting. I just stopped pretending it was fair." The child nodded, satisfied. And Cornelius realized he'd just had the most honest political conversation of his life with an 11-year-old in Southwark. He started funding schools, not big donations to prestigious institutions, small donations to local schools, places where children like Margaret's went, places that needed books and paper and teachers who weren't dying of tuberculosis. Eleanor managed it. She was good at this, better than Cornelius. She understood poverty from the inside. Understood what people needed versus what rich people thought they needed. She kept him honest, kept him from turning philanthropy into another form of control. "Mr. Grimwald, you can't require schools to teach accounting." "Why not? It's practical." "Because children need art, need music, need things that make no economic sense but make survival bearable. That's inefficient. That's the point." He was learning. Slowly. The same way you learn a foreign language. With mistakes and embarrassment and gradual imperfect progress. He was learning that efficiency isn't always virtue, that waste is sometimes wisdom, that the human things, the art and music and poetry and love, are what make the efficient things worth doing. Summer passed, July, August. London emptied. Everyone who could afford it left for the countryside. The city became a different place, quieter, hotter, more itself. The people who remained were the people who'd always remained, the poor. The working, the ones who couldn't afford to escape. Cornelius stayed, partly because he had nowhere to go, partly because he wanted to see London without its wealthy layers, wanted to understand the city that existed when people like him disappeared. It was harder, hotter, smellier. The Thames became a chemical soup. Disease spread. Children died. The summer that was pleasant in Mayfair was deadly in Whitechapel. And Cornelius, walking through both, saw the inequality he'd always known intellectually but never felt viscerally. He gave more money, paid for clean water, paid for doctors, paid for funerals when people couldn't afford them. It felt like emptying the ocean with a spoon. But what else could he do? Not giving money because it wasn't enough was just an excuse to give nothing. Eleanor appreciated the effort, but she was also blunt. "Mr. Grimwald, you realize you can't charity your way out of structural inequality?" "I know. Then why do this?" "Because I don't know what else to do. I can't change the system. I'm one person, but I can help specific people. I can make specific suffering slightly less terrible, and maybe that's enough." "It's not. I know, but it's something." They stood outside a tenement in Shoreditch. Inside, a family Eleanor was helping. 7 people in 2 rooms. Father dead, mother sick. Children working in factories. A life measured in survival and small catastrophes. And Cornelius was giving them money for rent and medicine and food. It would help for a month, maybe 2. Then they'd be back where they started. "This is futile," he said. "Yes. We should still do it." "Yes." They went inside, gave the mother the money. She cried, not from gratitude, from exhaustion, from the weight of surviving in a system designed to crush her. And Cornelius felt the helplessness of being rich in a world of poverty, of having resources but no solutions, of being able to help but not enough. That night, he couldn't sleep. Lay in his comfortable bed in his comfortable house and stared at the ceiling, thinking about the woman in Shoreditch, about Margaret, about all the people he'd met since December, about the enormous, crushing weight of inequality that no amount of charity could fix. He got up, 3 in the morning, lit a candle. Just one. Habit. Then lit another. Because why not? Then another. Until his bedroom was full of light. Wasteful, beautiful, completely irrational light. And he sat in that light and cried, not quietly, not efficiently, full, ugly crying. For his mother who'd died apologizing for costing money. For his father who'd counted pennies until his heart stopped. For Thomas Whitmore, who'd died of cholera because clean water was too expensive. For every person ground up by the machinery of capitalism that he'd helped build and maintain and profit from. Crying didn't fix anything, didn't change the system, didn't bring anyone back. But it was honest, it was acknowledgement, it was the opposite of calculation, and maybe that mattered. He blew out the candles eventually, all but one. Watched that one burn, watched the wax melt and pool, and eventually consume the wick. Watched it die. And understood something about light and life and the fact that everything burns out eventually, but you light it anyway. Morning came. He slept for 2 hours, woke exhausted, but somehow lighter, made tea, looked at his account books. He had £183,000 left, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life, and every day that number would shrink as he gave more away. Eventually he'd have nothing, or not nothing. He wasn't that dramatic. But significantly less. He'd become the kind of person who counted money because he had to, not because he wanted to control it. And that prospect, which should have terrified him, felt like relief, because the fortress had finally fallen, not dramatically, just slowly, brick by brick, candle by candle, until nothing remained except him. Undefended, vulnerable, human. September arrived. Cool mornings, golden light. The city filling back up as people returned from holidays, Parliament resuming. The social season starting, everything returning to normal. Except nothing was normal. Not for Cornelius, not anymore. He received an invitation from a charity. They were having a gala, raising money for schools. They wanted him to attend, to speak, to be an example of redemption. The reformed Scrooge, the man who learned his lesson. He declined, because he hadn't learned a lesson. He'd had a breakdown that looked like growth. He'd lost control and decided to call it wisdom. He was still figuring out how to be human, still making mistakes, still occasionally counting candles and having to consciously stop. He wasn't redeemed. He was just less terrible, and that doesn't deserve a gala. But the invitation made him think about stories, about how culture needs villains who become heroes, needs transformation narratives, needs proof that people can change. Because if people can't change, what's the point of trying? He understood the need for that story. But he also knew it was a lie, or not a lie, simplification. He hadn't transformed. He'd just started noticing what had always been true. That efficiency without compassion is cruelty. That control is fear. That mathematics can describe everything except the things that matter. He wrote a letter to the charity, declined the invitation, but sent money, a lot of money, £20,000, with a note, "I can't speak at your gala because I don't have wisdom to share. But I can pay for 50 children to go to school. That's better than a speech." The charity accepted, probably disappointed. But money spends the same whether it comes with redemption or just recognition of complicity. October, the city preparing for winter, days getting shorter, temperature dropping, that feeling in the air of darkness returning. And with it, the memory of last Christmas, the candles, the rebellion, the moment London collectively decided that joy was more important than taxes. People were already planning, Margaret told him. Everyone's buying candles early this year, just in case. In case of what? In case you try to tax them again. I won't. We know. But it's fun to pretend you might. Makes Christmas feel rebellious. Cornelius laughed. Actual laughter, still uncomfortable, still unpracticed, but real. I accidentally made Christmas punk rock. You did. You should be proud. I destroyed my reputation and nearly caused a riot. Exactly. That's more interesting than anything else you've ever done. She was right. His whole life, the banking, the success, the money, was boring. Predictable. Safe. The candle tax was stupid and wrong, and the most human thing he'd ever done because it came from feeling instead of calculation. He decided to do something stupid again, on purpose this time. He told Eleanor his plan. She laughed for 5 minutes straight, then said, "That's the dumbest, most beautiful thing you've ever thought of." Let's do it. The plan. On December 1st, he would open his house in Mayfair to anyone who wanted candles. Free candles. As many as they wanted. No questions, no forms, no taxation, just light, just permission to be wasteful. Eleanor spread the word, through churches, through markets, through the networks of people she'd helped. Cornelius Grimwald is giving away candles, free, all December, because he's either very sorry or very insane. Probably both. December 1st arrived cold and grey. Cornelius stood in his entrance hall surrounded by 10,000 candles. He'd spent £12,000 on candles. Eleanor thought he was having another breakdown. Withers thought his employer had finally, completely lost his mind. But Cornelius felt calm. This made sense, not logical sense, emotional sense. He'd tried to tax light. Now he was giving it away. He'd tried to control joy. Now he was funding it. He'd tried to make Christmas efficient. Now he was making it as wasteful as possible. The first person arrived at noon. An old woman from Lambeth. "Is it true? Free candles?" "Yes. How many do you want?" "How many can I have?" "As many as you can carry." She took 20, cried, said, "God bless you, sir," and left. Then more people, slowly at first, then in waves, families, children, street vendors, sex workers, thieves probably. Cornelius didn't care. Everyone got candles, rich people too. He didn't discriminate. Because waste doesn't discriminate. Beauty doesn't discriminate. Light is for everyone. By evening, he'd given away 3,000 candles. His entrance hall was chaos. People everywhere, laughing, arguing about wax versus tallow, children playing with wicks. The kind of beautiful disaster that happens when you remove rules and just let humans be human. Margaret came at 6, with her children. They stared at the remaining candles like they were treasure. "Mr. Grimwald, are you having a breakdown?" "Possibly. How many candles do you want?" "I already have candles." "I know, but these are spite candles. They're different." She laughed. "Spite candles. I love that. Give me 50. "That's excessive." "That's the point." He gave her 60. "Because if you're going to be wastefully wasteful." Her children carried them out, struggling under the weight, ecstatic. The giveaway continued. Every day, December 2nd, 3rd, 4th, more people. More candles, word spreading, newspapers covering it. Grimwald's candle folly and the mad philanthropist of Mayfair and Christmas chaos in the capital. Cornelius read the articles and didn't care. Let them think he was mad. Mad was better than calculating. Mad was alive. Mad was the opposite of the fortress he'd lived in for 47 years. By December 10th, he'd given away all 10,000 candles, spent £12,000 on wax and wick, and the completely irrational project of lighting London for free. Eleanor ran the numbers. "That's £12,000 you'll never see again." "I know. You could have helped 100 families with that money." "I helped 1,000 families light candles. That's different, not better, just different." "Is it?" Cornelius thought about it. Honest thought. "I don't know. But I needed to do it. Needed to prove to myself that I could waste money on beauty, that I could fund joy instead of just survival, that I could choose light over logic." Eleanor nodded. "Then it was worth it. Was it?" "You're asking me. You're the one who gave away £12,000 of candles." "I'm asking because I genuinely don't know. I don't know if what I'm doing helps. I don't know if any of this matters. I just know I can't go back to calculating. Can't go back to the fortress. Can't go back to being the man who tried to tax Christmas." "Then you're doing fine." "Am I?" "No, but nobody is. We're all just making mistakes and hoping some of them turn out to be wisdom." That night, Cornelius lit candles in his house. Not 1, not 2, 47. The same number Margaret had lit last year. He sat in that light and thought about transformation, about whether people actually change or just become different versions of their fears. He still counted, still calculated, still had to consciously stop himself from optimizing everything, still felt the pull of efficiency, still wanted to control chaos, still was, fundamentally, Cornelius Thaddeus Grimwald, the man who tried to tax Christmas. But he was also the man who gave away 10,000 candles, who cried in the middle of the night, who visited Margaret every Tuesday, who funded schools and paid for medicine and tried badly and imperfectly to be less terrible. And maybe that was enough. Maybe change isn't transformation. Maybe it's just choosing different mistakes. Maybe it's just lighting one more candle than you did yesterday. Maybe it's just burning money on beauty, because beauty is the only thing that makes survival worthwhile. The candles burned, the room glowed, and Cornelius, alone in his house that was finally becoming a home, felt something like peace. Not happiness, peace. The acceptance that he would never be fully human, would never be spontaneous or free or easy. But he could be trying, and trying was enough. Outside, London prepared for Christmas. Houses filling with light. People buying candles, cheap ones now, because the market was flooded thanks to him. Churches planning illuminations. Children excited. Adults pretending to be cynical but secretly looking forward to it. And somewhere in the city, someone was probably planning to tax something stupid, because that's what humans do. We see joy and try to control it. We see beauty and try to measure it. We see light and try to own it. But we also see darkness and light candles anyway. See winter and celebrate anyway. See suffering and love anyway. See a man who tried to tax Christmas and forgive him anyway. And maybe that's the story, not redemption. Just the stubborn human refusal to let darkness win. just the irrational decision to burn candles even when it doesn't make economic sense. Just the magnificent, wasteful, beautiful act of choosing light over logic. Every single time. December 1892. 1 year since the candle tax. 1 year since London burned with rebellion. 1 year since Cornelius Grimwald accidentally became the villain in a story about joy versus calculation. And now, standing in his depleted townhouse, surrounded by empty candle boxes and the lingering smell of wax, he was attempting something harder than taxation. He was attempting to understand forgiveness, not from others. London had mostly forgiven him, or at least moved on. Londoners are pragmatic. You can't hold grudges forever when you're busy surviving. But self-forgiveness, that was different. That was math he couldn't calculate. That was a ledger that wouldn't balance. Eleanor visited on December 12th, found him in his study, staring at account books, not working, just staring, like they might reveal some secret if he looked long enough. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you. I'm serious. When did you last eat?" "Yesterday, I think." She sat down, uninvited, comfortable. They'd become friends, actual friends, the kind where you don't have to perform, where you can be tired and broken and it's fine. "What's wrong?" "I keep running the numbers." "What numbers?" "All of them. The money I made, the loans I gave that destroyed people, the houses I foreclosed on, the lives I ruined by being efficient. I'm trying to calculate if what I'm doing now erases what I did then, if the good balances the bad, if I can mathematically achieve redemption." Eleanor was quiet, long quiet, the kind that means you're thinking, not ignoring. Finally, "You can't." "Can't what?" "Can't calculate redemption. It doesn't work that way. You're trying to use the same tool that created the problem to solve it. That's like trying to put out fire with fire." "Then what do I do?" "You stop trying to solve it. You just live with it. Live with being someone who did harm. Live with trying to do less harm now. Live with the fact that you can't erase the past by spending money on the present." "That's unsatisfying." "I know." Cornelius put his head in his hands, not crying, just heavy. The weight of 47 years of calculated cruelty pressing down. "I keep thinking about the people I foreclosed on. The families. Where did they go? What happened to them? Did they survive? Did children die because I took their homes? Probably. That's not comforting. It's not supposed to be. You did harm, real harm. And giving away candles doesn't erase that. Neither does funding schools. Neither does visiting Margaret every Tuesday. You can't undo it. You can only stop doing it and try to do something else instead. But what if something else isn't enough? It isn't. It never will be. That's the point. You'll never do enough good to balance the harm. The ledger won't zero out. You just have to live with that debt. Cornelius looked up, studied Eleanor. She was harsh, but not cruel. Honest, but not punishing. She understood something he was struggling to learn. That morality isn't mathematics. That you can't calculate your way to being good. That redemption isn't a transaction. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Do what?" "Work with people like me. Rich people trying to buy absolution. Doesn't it make you angry? Every day. Then why help me?" Eleanor considered this, real consideration, because anger alone doesn't help anyone. I could spend my life being angry at rich people, or I could convince some of them to give away their money. Both are valid, but one feeds people. That's pragmatic. I learned from the best. They smiled, small smiles, sad smiles, the kind you exchange when you're both broken in compatible ways. Eleanor stood up. "Come with me. I want to show you something." "Where?" "Trust me." They took a carriage to Whitechapel. Cornelius had been here before on his walks, but never with Eleanor. She led him through narrow streets, past tenements, past pubs, past the evidence of poverty he'd helped create and maintain. Finally, she stopped at a building, old, barely standing, the kind of place that should have been condemned but wasn't, because where would people go? "This building," Eleanor said, "was owned by one of your banks." Cornelius's stomach dropped. "Was? You foreclosed 3 years ago. 12 families evicted. 3 children died that winter. 1 from pneumonia, 2 from starvation. I know because I helped bury them. The numbers hit him like physics, real, undeniable, not abstract calculations, actual dead children, actual harm, actual consequences of his efficiency. Why are you showing me this? Because you asked how to live with it. This is how. You look at it, you acknowledge it, you let it hurt. And then you wake up the next day and try to do less harm, that's all. There's no redemption, no balance, no calculation that makes this okay. Just the choice to stop doing it and do something else instead. Cornelius stared at the building, memorizing it, the broken windows, the crumbling brick, the memorial to his efficient cruelty, and he felt something break inside him. Not violently, just finally. The last piece of the fortress falling. The last illusion that he could fix this, that he could calculate his way back to innocence. I can't undo this, he said. No. I can't bring them back. No. I can't fix what I broke. No. Then what's the point of trying? Eleanor put her hand on his shoulder. Brief, awkward, but genuine. Because the alternative is doing more harm, because trying to do better is better than not trying. Because those children are dead, but there are living children who need help and you have resources, and that's not redemption, but it's something. They stood in silence. Cold December air, grey sky, the building standing like an accusation, and Cornelius understood something fundamental. He would never be forgiven. Not really, not completely. He would carry this weight forever, and that was right. That was appropriate. That was the cost of harm. But he could also carry candles, could give away money, could visit Margaret, could fund schools, could do small, insufficient acts of repair that would never balance the ledger, but might prevent a little future harm. And maybe that was the real lesson of the candle tax. Not that he'd learned to be good, but that he'd learned to be less bad. Not that he'd transformed, but that he'd stopped. And stopping is progress, and progress is enough. They walked back to the carriage. Eleanor gave the driver an address. They rode in silence, comfortable silence, the silence of two people who understood that some things don't need words. The carriage stopped at a school, small, crumbling, one of the places Cornelius was funding. Eleanor led him inside. Children everywhere. Learning, reading, drawing, alive, noisy, inefficient, beautiful. A teacher saw Eleanor, smiled. Miss Price and Mr. Grimwald. Children, say hello. A chaos of hellos, badly coordinated. Some shy, some enthusiastic. Some ignoring them completely because children have their own priorities. One child approached Cornelius, maybe 7 years old, missing a tooth. Are you the man who tried to tax Christmas? Cornelius knelt, eye level. Yes, that was stupid. It was. My mum says you're trying to be better now. I am. Are you succeeding? Cornelius looked at Eleanor, at the teacher, at the classroom full of children who existed because he'd given money for this building. Children who might otherwise be working, or dying, or never learning to read, and he felt the impossible complexity of harm and repair. I don't know, he told the child. I'm trying. The child nodded, satisfied, and ran off to join friends, because children don't need complex answers. They just need honest ones. Cornelius stood, looked around the classroom, at the books, the paper, the heat, the evidence of money translated into opportunity. It wasn't enough. Would never be enough. But it was something. Thank you, he told Eleanor. For what? For showing me both, the harm and the help, the debt and the payment, the reality of what I did and what I'm doing. You needed to see it. I did. They left, returned to Mayfair. Eleanor dropped him at his house. Before she left, she said, Mr. Grimwald, you asked about forgiveness, about whether you can calculate it. You can't. But here's what you can do. You can remember. Remember the building. Remember the children. Remember what efficiency costs when it's applied to human lives, and then wake up tomorrow and choose differently. That's not redemption, but it's something. Cornelius nodded. It's something. That night he lit candles again, Not 47, just 3. One for each dead child. A ritual that accomplished nothing. A gesture that changed nothing. A completely irrational act of remembrance for people he'd never met, but had killed with paperwork. He sat with those candles until they burned out. Watched them die. Thought about fire and light and the fact that everything burns eventually, but you light it anyway. Thought about harm and repair and the math that never balances. Thought about Christmas coming. About London preparing to celebrate. About the fact that life continues even when you've realized you're a monster. And he made a decision. A small decision. But decisions are cumulative. Small choices add up. Eventually they become a life. He would stop trying to calculate redemption. Would stop trying to balance the ledger. Would stop trying to fix what he'd broken. Instead, he would just try. Try to do less harm. Try to create more light. Try to remember what his efficiency had cost while choosing inefficiency now. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't enough. But it was honest. And honesty, after 47 years of calculated lies, was its own kind of progress. Outside, London glowed. Early Christmas lights. People preparing. Children excited. The machine of capitalism grinding on, creating harm and joy in equal measure. And Cornelius, inside his fortress that had finally fallen, understood that he was part of that machine, would always be part of it, could never fully escape it. But he could gum up the works a little, could throw candles into the gears, could waste money on beauty and call it resistance, could choose light over logic and call it progress. And maybe, after enough small choices, after enough candles, after enough years of trying to be less terrible, he might eventually become something like human. Not good, just human. Flawed and trying and aware of his flaws. And that would have to be enough. Because enough is all anyone gets. And enough chosen deliberately becomes everything. December 24th, 1892. Exactly 1 year since London burned. Since Margaret lit 47 candles. Since Cornelius stood on London Bridge and felt wonder for the first time in decades. Christmas Eve again. A chance to see if anything had actually changed, or if this had all been performance, theatre, a rich man playing at transformation. Cornelius woke at dawn. Couldn't sleep. Anxiety or anticipation, hard to tell. They feel the same in your chest. He made tea. Weak tea. Because he'd learned from Margaret that wasting money on expensive tea was less important than wasting it on other people. Small lesson, significant shift. His house was different now, still in Mayfair, still expensive, but different, lived in. There were books on tables instead of shelves, empty candle stubs scattered around, letters from people Eleanor had helped pin to a board in his study, evidence of existence instead of efficiency. Withers appeared, he'd changed too. Smiled occasionally, took days off, had mentioned almost shyly that he'd started seeing someone, a woman from the market. Cornelius had given him money for flowers. Withers had cried, men his age weren't supposed to cry, but sometimes you have to break rules to become human. Happy Christmas Eve, sir. Happy Christmas Eve, Withers. Will you be having your usual breakfast? I don't have a usual breakfast anymore. True, shall I surprise you? Please do. Withers brought eggs, toast, actual butter instead of the margarine Cornelius had eaten for years because it was economical. Small luxuries. Small acknowledgements that survival without pleasure is just slow death. After breakfast, Cornelius walked, his usual route, through Mayfair, through Hyde Park, toward the river. The city was different on Christmas Eve. Quieter, anticipatory. Shops closed. People home with families. The machinery of capitalism temporarily paused for obligatory celebration. He walked past his old bank. Someone else ran it now. He'd sold his shares, kept minimal involvement. The new owners were younger, more aggressive, more efficient, making the same mistakes he'd made, just faster. He could have stopped it, could have imposed conditions on the sale, but that would be control. And he was trying to let go of control. Still hurt, though, watching the machine continue without him, watching harm compound, watching efficiency crush people in new, innovative ways. Sometimes letting go feels like complicity. Sometimes it is complicity. The math doesn't get easier just because you're trying to be better. He reached the river, London Bridge. The same spot where he'd stood last year, where everything had cracked. He stood there now, looked east, looked west, and tried to see what had changed. The city looked the same, buildings, Thames, sky, people, all the same physical components, but something was different. Or maybe he was different. Maybe that's all change ever is. Same world, different eyes. Behind him, Mr. Grimwald? He turned. Margaret, with all 4 children. They were dressed nicely, not wealthy nice, but clean, intact. The kind of nice that comes from having a little security, from not having to choose between food and shoes. Margaret, what are you doing here? Could ask you the same thing. Remembering last year? Same. They stood together, 5 humans and 1 reformed calculator, looking at the river, at the city that had collectively decided his tax was stupid and proven it with fire. Thank you, Margaret said. For what? The money, the candles, the visits, everything. This year was easier. Not easy, but easier, and that's because of you. Cornelius felt uncomfortable. Praise always made him uncomfortable. I didn't do much. You gave me £100. You funded my children's school. You visited every week like we were equals. That's not nothing. It's not enough either. Nothing's ever enough. But it's something. Her eldest child tugged her sleeve. Mum, can we go home? I'm cold. Soon, love. The child looked at Cornelius. Sir, are you taxing Christmas again? No. Good. That was stupid. It was. Mum says you learned your lesson. Cornelius looked at Margaret. She shrugged. Simplified version. Did I learn my lesson? You're still here. Still trying. That's something. They said goodbye. Margaret and her children heading back to Southwark. Cornelius heading where? He didn't have family. Didn't have traditional Christmas plans. Just his empty house and his uncomfortable relationship with joy. He walked to St. Mary's, the church where he'd first learned to light candles. The old woman wasn't there. Dead, probably. People that age died. But other people were there. Lighting candles, praying, sitting in silence, doing whatever humans do in churches when they're looking for meaning in stone and stained glass. He lit a candle. 3, actually. Same ritual as before. For the children who died because he'd been efficient. Then a 4th for himself, for the man he'd been. The one who'd tried to tax Christmas. A memorial candle for his old life. Because that person was dead now, and you light candles for the dead. A priest approached. Young, enthusiastic. The kind who thinks religion solves things. Welcome, my son. First time here? No. I've been coming since summer. Wonderful. Are you finding comfort? Cornelius considered this. Honest consideration. I'm finding acknowledgement, not quite the same as comfort. What are you acknowledging? That I caused harm, that I can't fix it, that I have to live with that weight while also choosing to do less harm going forward. That's not comfort, but it's reality. The priest looked confused. He'd probably expected a simpler answer. Something about Jesus or redemption. But Cornelius was learning that religious spaces don't have to be religious. They can just be spaces. Places to sit with truth. Even uncomfortable truth. He left the church. Walked to Eleanor's office. She was there. Of course she was there. Eleanor never took days off because poverty doesn't take days off. She was organizing files, lists of people who needed help, lists of people Cornelius's money was helping. Lists of people falling through the cracks because no amount of charity fixes structural inequality. You're working on Christmas Eve, he said. So are you, apparently. I don't have anywhere else to be. Neither do I. They sat in her cramped office, surrounded by evidence of need, of harm, of the endless, exhausting work of trying to make things slightly less terrible. How many people did we help this year? Cornelius asked. 347 directly. Probably 1,000 indirectly. School funding, medicine, rent assistance, funeral costs. And how many needed help? 50,000. Minimum. The math was devastating. 347 out of 50,000. Less than 1%, a rounding error, statistically meaningless. The ledger didn't balance, would never balance. "This is futile," he said. "Yes. We should do more next year." "Yes." Eleanor smiled. Tired smile. Real smile. The kind you exchange with someone who understands that futile doesn't mean meaningless, that impossible doesn't mean not worth attempting, that you light candles even when the darkness is infinite, because what else are you going to do? They worked for another hour. Made lists for next year. Identified families for Eleanor to visit. Calculated how much money Cornelius had left and how to distribute it. Mathematics of mercy. Accounting of insufficient repair. At 6 o'clock, Eleanor packed her files. "I'm going home." "You have a home?" "I rent a room in Bethnal Green. That's home enough." "Do you have Christmas plans?" "I'm going to sleep for 12 hours. That's my plan." "That sounds perfect." She paused at the door. "Mr. Grimwald, I know you're struggling with whether any of this matters, whether you're doing enough, whether you've changed, and I can't answer those questions. But I can tell you this. 347 families had a better year because of you. That's not redemption. That's not enough. But it's 347 reasons to keep trying." She left. And Cornelius sat in the empty office, surrounded by lists, surrounded by evidence of need he couldn't meet, surrounded by the weight of trying to repair harm while existing in a system designed to create more harm. He should have felt despair. He felt something else, not hope. Hope was too optimistic, something more like determination. The stubborn, irrational, completely human determination to keep fighting even when the fight is unwinnable, to keep lighting candles even when the darkness is infinite, to keep trying even when trying isn't enough. He walked home. Through Christmas Eve London. Through streets full of people heading to families and friends and traditional celebrations. Through a city that had mostly forgotten about his stupid tax. Through the evidence that life continues regardless of individual transformation. That the world doesn't wait for you to fix yourself before moving on. At home, Withers had prepared dinner. Not elaborate, just stew, bread, beer. The kind of meal you eat when you're too tired to perform. They ate together. Master and servant eating at the same table because those labels were starting to feel less meaningful. Both just men. Both just trying to get through winter. Both just human. After dinner, Cornelius went to his study, to the drawer where he kept Margaret's letters. The original one from last year, the others she'd sent throughout the year. Updates about her children, questions about money, stories about her neighbors, small moments of connection. Small pieces of evidence that he existed in relation to others, instead of alone in his fortress. He read them, all of them, slowly, and felt gratitude. Not for what he'd done, that was still insufficient, but for what had happened, for the crack in his fortress, for the rebellion of 47 candles, for London teaching him through fire and mockery that you can't tax joy. That efficiency isn't virtue. That light is more important than logic. At midnight, church bells rang. Christmas officially arriving, London celebrating, and Cornelius did something he hadn't done since childhood. He lit candles, not 3, not 47, 100, every candle he owned, every bit of wax in his house, turned his study into a bonfire, into a cathedral, into an irrational, wasteful, beautiful declaration that he was still trying, still choosing light, still participating in the human project of fighting darkness with fire. He sat in that light. Alone, but not lonely. Broken but healing, wrong but trying. And he thought about the year, about what had changed and what hadn't, about how transformation is just small choices accumulating, about how being human is just trying to be less terrible, one day at a time, forever. The candles burned. The room glowed. Outside, London slept. And Cornelius Thaddeus Grimwald, the man who tried to tax Christmas, spent his second Christmas Eve sitting in wasteful light, counting nothing, calculating nothing, just being. Just existing. Just proving that sometimes the most rebellious thing you can do is choose beauty over efficiency. Just being human, finally, imperfectly. Enough. January 1893. New Year. Same city, same people. But something had shifted in the collective consciousness. Not obviously. London doesn't do obvious transformations, but quietly, in conversations and pubs and markets, people were talking about Christmas differently, about candles differently, about the right to be wasteful differently. The candle tax had failed spectacularly, but it had succeeded at something Cornelius never intended. It had politicized joy, made celebration an act of resistance, turned lighting candles into a statement. And now, 3 months later, the effects were rippling outward in ways nobody had predicted. In Parliament, someone proposed a new tax, on theatres, entertainment tax, they called it. Revenue enhancement, completely reasonable. Except London remembered. Remembered what happened when you tax things that make survival bearable. Remembered 47 candles and a city burning with rebellion. The proposal died in committee, not because of logic, because of optics, because nobody wanted to be the next Cornelius Grimwald. Nobody wanted to be the villain in a story about joy versus calculation. The candle tax had become a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when you try to tax happiness. Cornelius read about it in the Times, sitting in his study, surrounded by receipts from Eleanor's work. And he felt something complicated, not pride, the tax had been stupid, but recognition that sometimes failures teach better lessons than successes, that his public humiliation had accidentally protected something, had drawn a line around joy and said, "This far, no further." He wrote a letter to the editor, not defending the candle tax, explaining what he'd learned about efficiency versus humanity, about calculation versus compassion, about the danger of treating people like numbers on ledgers. The Times published it. Page 4, small article, Reflections from the Man Who Tried to Tax Christmas. Responses arrived, dozens of them, some supportive, some angry, some from people he'd harmed through his banking work, people who said candles were the least of it. What about the houses? What about the lives? What about the children who died because he'd been efficient? He read every letter. Kept them all. Responded to some, not with excuses, with acknowledgement. "You're right, I caused harm. I can't undo it. I can only try to do less harm now. That's insufficient, but it's what I have." Some people accepted this, some didn't. Both responses were valid. Because harm is harm, and acknowledgement doesn't erase it, just stops it from being invisible. Margaret visited on her usual Tuesday, found him reading letters, looking tired. Looking like someone carrying weight they couldn't put down. "You're torturing yourself," she said. "I'm acknowledging reality." Same thing sometimes. She made tea. They sat. Ritual they'd developed. Tuesday afternoons. Tea and truth. Two people from different worlds connected by candles and letters, and the mutual recognition that life is harder than it should be. "Do you ever regret lighting 47 candles?" he asked. "Never. Do you regret the tax?" "Every day. But I'm also grateful for it." "How can you be grateful for something you regret?" "Because it broke me, and I needed to break. I was living in a fortress, alone, convinced I was right about everything. The tax was stupid enough to crack that certainty, to let reality in, to force me to see what I'd been ignoring." Margaret considered this. "So your worst mistake was your best teacher?" "Yes, which is frustrating because I'd prefer to learn from being smart instead of being stupid." She laughed, real laugh. "Nobody learns from being smart. Smart people think they already know everything. Only idiots learn, because we have to." "Are you calling me an idiot?" "I'm calling you someone who tried to tax Christmas, if the shoe fits." They smiled. Easy smiles. Friend smiles. The kind that come from knowing someone's worst and staying anyway. Margaret's children burst in. They'd been playing in the street. Cold red faces. Loud voices. The beautiful chaos of children who aren't starving, who have shoes. who can afford to play instead of work. The youngest climbed into Cornelius's lap. Unexpected, uncomfortable. He froze. Didn't know what to do with children. Never had children, never wanted them. But here was one, in his lap, smelling like cold air and childhood. "Sir, tell us a story." "I don't know any stories." "Everyone knows stories. Tell us about when you were young." Cornelius looked at Margaret. "Help me." She shrugged. "You're on your own." He tried to think of appropriate stories, couldn't. His childhood had been cold mutton and colder silence. Not exactly entertainment. "When I was your age," he started, "I didn't have Christmas. My father thought it was wasteful. So we just had dinner, regular dinner, and silence." "That's sad." It was. "Is that why you tried to tax candles? Because you never had them?" Out of the mouths of children, 7 years old and more perceptive than most adults. Cornelius felt something crack, not breaking, just opening. "Yes, I think that's exactly why." "But you have candles now." "I do." "So you're not sad anymore?" "I'm less sad." "Good." The child climbed down, ran off to join siblings. Crisis resolved. Adults complicated everything. Children just wanted to know if you were okay. And if the answer was sort of, that was good enough. After they left, Margaret said, "You're good with them." "I'm terrible with them." "You're honest with them." "Same thing." "Is it?" "They don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be real. You're real, that's rare, especially in rich people." Cornelius thought about this, about performance versus authenticity, about how wealth lets you hide, lets you perform being human without risking actual humanity, about how the candle tax had stripped away that performance, had exposed him, had made him visible. "I'm not good," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not redeemed. I'm not fixed. I'm just trying, and most days trying feels like failure." "That's because you're measuring wrong." "What do you mean?" "You're still thinking in terms of success and failure. Pass or fail, good or bad. But life isn't a test. It's just continuing. You continue, you try, you fail, you try again. That's not failure. That's just how it works. That's unsatisfying. Most true things are. They sat in silence, comfortable silence. The kind that feels like communication even though nobody's talking. Outside London continued, people working, children playing, the machinery of existence grinding forward regardless of individual transformation. Cornelius thought about legacy, about what remains after you die. He'd built a fortune, created a bank, made money, and all of it felt meaningless now, hollow, just numbers that would eventually be spent by people he'd never meet. But 47 candles, that mattered. That had started something, a small revolution, a reminder that joy is non-negotiable, that beauty is necessary, that humans need more than survival to actually live. "Do you think I'll be remembered?" he asked. "For what? The banking or the candles?" "Either. Both." Margaret thought about it. "Honestly? You'll be a footnote. A weird story. The man who tried to tax Christmas. A cautionary tale. Maybe a joke. But you won't be remembered the way you want to be." "How do I want to be remembered?" "As good, as redeemed, as someone who learned his lesson and became better. But that's not how it works. You'll be remembered for your worst mistake. That's what people remember. The spectacular failures, the stupid taxes, the moments when someone powerful revealed they were human and therefore ridiculous. That's depressing. That's honest." Cornelius absorbed this, the death of the redemption narrative. The acceptance that he would always be the villain in the candle story, that no amount of charity or change would erase that his legacy was stupidity, not wisdom. And strangely, it felt like relief, because if he couldn't be redeemed, he could stop trying, could stop performing transformation, could just be, could just continue, could just light candles and give away money and visit Margaret on Tuesdays without it being part of some grand narrative arc. "Thank you," he said. For what? For being honest, for not letting me perform redemption, for treating me like a person instead of a project. You're welcome. Though honestly, I'm just treating you like everyone else. Most people are terrible. Most people are trying. You're not special. I'm not special. You're really not. Good. They finished their tea. Margaret gathered her children, left, and Cornelius sat in his study, looking at letters from people he'd harmed, feeling the weight of being unspecial. Of being ordinary, of being just another person trying and failing and trying again. It should have felt like defeat. It felt like freedom, because if you're not the hero, you don't have to save anyone. You just have to not make things worse. You just have to light candles when it's dark. You just have to continue. That night he walked through London, through neighborhoods he'd harmed with foreclosures and loans, through streets where people lived in buildings he'd owned, renting from landlords who'd bought from him, trapped in systems he'd helped create. He couldn't fix it, couldn't undo it, couldn't make the ledger balance, could only acknowledge it, remember it, carry it, and choose tomorrow and the day after and every day until he died to do something different. Not better, different. Because better implied progress, implied improvement, implied a destination. But there was no destination. Just continuing, just the endless, exhausting, necessary work of being human in a world designed to crush humanity. He returned home, lit candles, not symbolically, not ritually, just because it was dark, and candles make light, simple, practical, the least complicated thing he'd done in years. And sitting in that simple light, Cornelius understood something fundamental. Legacy doesn't matter. Redemption doesn't matter. What matters is the next choice, the next candle. The next Tuesday with Margaret, the next letter from someone you harmed, the next chance to do less harm, that's all. That's everything. That's the only math that matters, not balance, not zero sum, just less. Less harm, less calculation, less fortress, less fear, less and less and less until maybe, possibly, what remains is something like humanity. The candles burned, the night passed, and London, indifferent to individual transformation, slept and dreamed and prepared for tomorrow, where everything would continue, where nothing would be solved, where people would still light candles against the dark. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the legacy of a stupid tax. The reminder that light is necessary, that joy is non-negotiable, that humans, when pushed, will always choose beauty over efficiency. Every single time. March 1893, spring attempting to arrive. Not successfully, this was London, but attempting. Grey skies lightening to lighter grey. Rain marginally less freezing. The kind of seasonal change that makes you remember that time passes whether you're ready or not. Cornelius was in his study doing something he'd avoided for months, actually calculating. Real mathematics, not charity distributions or candle budgets. His personal accounts, because at some point, even reformed calculators need to know where they stand financially. The numbers were concerning, not catastrophic, but concerning. He'd given away almost £2 million in 15 months. 2 million. The number looked absurd written down. More money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. Gone. Converted into rent payments and medicine and school buildings and 10,000 candles and 100 small acts of insufficient repair. He had £143,000 left, plus the townhouse, plus some investments he'd kept because Eleanor had insisted he needed security. Still wealthy by any reasonable measure, but no longer rich, no longer able to give away hundreds of thousands without consequence. The fortress had fallen. Now he was finding out what happened after. And what happened after was reality, constraints, the same concerns everyone else had, just delayed by wealth. He should have felt panic, felt the old fear of poverty that had driven him for 47 years. But he didn't. He felt curious. What happens when money runs out? What happens when you can't charity your way through guilt? What happens when you have to actually live instead of just fund other people's living? Eleanor arrived at noon. He'd asked her to come, to help him calculate what was sustainable. She reviewed his accounts with professional efficiency, running numbers, making notes, occasionally wincing at his more extravagant expenses. "You spent £12,000 on candles," she said. "I'm aware." "That was stupid. I know. Are you going to do it again?" "Probably not. Can't afford it." She smiled, small smile. "You're learning." "Learning what?" "Limits. Everyone else lives with limits. Now you do too. Welcome to being normal." "Normal feels uncomfortable." "That's because you've never been normal. You've been either desperately poor or excessively rich. Normal is the hard part. Normal is having enough to be okay, but not enough to escape consequences. Normal is where most people live." Cornelius processed this. Normal, average, unspecial. The opposite of everything he'd built his identity around, and it felt fine, not good, fine, which was better than expected. "How long can I sustain current giving levels?" he asked. Eleanor ran calculations. 3 years, maybe 4 if you're careful. Then you'll need income, actual work, probably not banking, maybe teaching. You're good at explaining things, terrible at emotions, but good at logic. "Teaching what?" "Accounting, mathematics, how to run a business without destroying people. You have expertise, use it." "That feels too practical." "That's the point. You spent 47 years being impractical in one direction, pure efficiency. Then 15 months being impractical in the other direction, pure charity. Now you get to be practical, balanced, boring, human. Boring, human." The words sat uncomfortably. He'd never aspired to boring. Boring was what other people were. Boring was mediocrity. Boring was admitting you weren't special. But maybe that was the point. Maybe transformation wasn't becoming special. It was becoming ordinary. It was joining the mass of humanity, trying to survive with limited resources and unlimited needs. It was lighting candles not because you could afford to waste them, but because darkness is terrible and you need light. "I don't know how to be boring," he admitted. "Nobody does. You just stop trying to be interesting. Stop performing. Stop calculating your legacy. Just exist, work, pay rent, light candles when it's dark. That's how everyone else does it. Everyone else doesn't have 15 months of very public transformation to live up to. So stop living up to it. You're not performing redemption anymore. You're just living. And living is boring. And boring is fine." They worked for another hour, created a budget, sustainable giving, 40 families per year instead of 300. Direct support instead of institutional funding. Small, manageable, insufficient help. The kind everyone else gave. The kind that acknowledged limits. It felt like defeat. It also felt like relief, because unlimited resources create unlimited responsibility. Limited resources create limited responsibility, and limited responsibility is survivable. You can't save everyone, but you can help some people, and some is enough when that's all you have. After Eleanor left, Cornelius sat with his new budget, his new limits, his new ordinary life, and thought about mathematics, about how numbers only mean something in context, about how £2 million was either infinite or nothing, depending on what you measured it against. Measured against need, nothing, completely insufficient, a drop in an ocean of poverty. Measured against his life, everything, his entire fortress dismantled, his entire safety net burned for candles and charity. Measured against redemption, irrelevant, because redemption isn't transactional, can't be bought, can't be calculated, just is or isn't. He pulled out his old ledgers, the ones from his banking days, before the candle tax, before the breakdown, before he'd learned that efficiency kills the things that make survival worthwhile. He opened them, read entries, saw the perfect handwriting, the balanced accounts, the evidence of a life lived entirely in numbers. It looked alien, like someone else had written it, someone who believed that people could be reduced to credit ratings and risk assessments, someone who thought controlling money meant controlling life, someone who'd never lit 47 candles just to prove a point. He closed the ledgers, considered burning them, decided against it. Not because they mattered, because burning them would be dramatic, and he was trying to be less dramatic, trying to be boring, trying to just exist without everything being symbolic. He filed them away, in a drawer, with Margaret's letters and Eleanor's budget and the newspaper clippings about his stupid tax, archive of transformation, evidence that people change, not completely, not perfectly, just enough to be different, just enough to recognize themselves and recoil. That evening, he walked to Southwark, unannounced, just showed up at Margaret's door. She was cooking dinner. The children were fighting. Normal chaos. Normal life? The kind he'd never had because he'd been too poor, then too rich to be normal. "You're here," Margaret said. "I am. Is that okay?" "It's Tuesday." "It's Thursday." "Then no, it's weird. Come in anyway." He came in. The children stopped fighting long enough to acknowledge him, then resumed. Margaret stirred something that smelled like cabbage and hope. They didn't talk, just existed in parallel. Him sitting at the table, her cooking, children being loud. Life happening without script or purpose. "I'm running out of money," he said eventually. "Good. Good. You needed to. You were using money to avoid living. Now you can't. Now you have to actually exist. That's progress. Poverty is progress. You're not going to be poor. You're going to be normal. There's a difference. Poor is not having choices. Normal is having limited choices. You're going to be normal. Finally. What if I'm bad at it? You will be. Everyone is at first. But you'll learn. You learn everything eventually. You're stupid but persistent." He smiled. Tired smile. "Thank you for the vote of confidence." "You're welcome." Dinner was cabbage soup, bread, weak tea. The kind of meal he'd spent 47 years trying to escape. And it was fine. Not good. Fine. Which was better than the elaborate meals he'd eaten alone in his townhouse, because fine with people beats good alone. After dinner, the children wanted stories. He'd gotten better at this. Not good, better. He told them about Yorkshire, about his father counting pennies, about growing up in a house where light was rationed, about learning that poverty doesn't build character, it just hurts. The children listened with the intensity of people who understood, who lived close enough to poverty to see it, who knew that only rich people romanticized it. "Sir, are you sad you're not rich anymore?" "I'm still rich, but not as rich." "No, not as rich." "Is that sad?" Cornelius thought about it, honest thought. "It's scary. I spent my whole life afraid of poverty, and now I'm choosing to be less wealthy. That should feel like loss, but it feels like relief, like I finally found the right size for my life. Not too big, not too small, just enough." The child nodded. "My mum says enough is better than too much." "Your mum is very wise." "I know." Margaret smiled. Pride smile. Mother smile. The kind that comes from raising children to understand things adults forget. That enough is enough. That too much becomes its own prison. That the best life is the one that fits you, not the one that impresses others. Cornelius left at 8, walked home through dark streets, through neighborhoods where people lived in enough, not plenty, enough. And he felt something shift, a final piece clicking into place, not transformation, just adjustment, like eyes adjusting to darkness, like learning to see what was always there. He'd spent 15 months trying to fix himself, trying to become good, trying to balance ledgers that would never balance. And all of it was wrong, because he wasn't fixing himself. He was just becoming different, not better, different, and different was enough. The mathematics of memory don't work like normal mathematics. They don't balance, they don't zero out, they accumulate. You carry everything, the harm you caused, the help you gave. The stupid tax, the 10,000 candles, all of it, forever. And it doesn't add up to redemption or damnation, it just adds up to a life, complex, contradictory, human. At home he lit one candle, just one, not symbolically, just because it was dark and he wanted light. And sitting in that single candle's glow, Cornelius Grimwald, former banker, former villain, current, nothing in particular, understood something final. Mathematics can describe everything. But it can't explain anything. Can't explain why 47 candles matter. Why giving away millions feels necessary. Why ordinary is the hardest thing to be. Why enough is better than everything. Those things exist outside calculation, in the realm of being human, where nothing balances but everything matters, where you light candles not because it's efficient, but because darkness is terrible, where you continue not because you're winning, but because continuing is the point. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the only equation worth solving, how to continue being human in a world that rewards being anything else. The candle burned, the night passed, and London, indifferent to individual revelations, slept and dreamed of spring. September 1893, 21 months since the candle tax. Autumn arriving with its usual grey enthusiasm. London preparing for winter. People buying coal, checking roofs. Doing the mathematics of survival that everyone except the very rich had to do. And now Cornelius was doing it too. His money was running out faster than projected. Eleanor's 3 to 4 year estimate was optimistic. At current rates, he had 18 months, maybe 2 years if he stopped all charitable giving, which he wouldn't, but he had to reduce it, had to make choices, had to become the thing he'd always feared, ordinary. He'd sold some investments. Reduced household staff. Withers was still there, but the cook had left, the maids had found other employment. The townhouse felt different, emptier, more like a home and less like a museum. He was learning to cook, badly, burning things, creating disasters, but eating them anyway because waste was waste. Margaret found it hilarious. Came over one evening and found him surrounded by burned potatoes and smoke. "You're 48 years old and you can't cook?" "I've never needed to." "Everyone needs to cook. I had staff. You don't anymore, learn." She taught him basic things, how to boil vegetables, how to make bread, how to not set fire to meat. He was terrible, but improving. Learning skills that working-class children learned at 6, better late than never, better humiliating than starving. He'd started looking for work, not because he needed it yet, because he would need it soon. And finding work at 48, with a reputation as the man who tried to tax Christmas, was harder than expected. The teaching idea wasn't working. Schools wanted credentials he didn't have. Universities wanted research he'd never done. Private tutoring was possible, but insufficient. Rich people didn't want the candle tax man teaching their children arithmetic. He considered returning to banking, could probably get a position. His expertise was valuable, but the thought made him nauseous. Going back to the thing that had created the problem felt like defeat, like admitting the transformation had been performance, like returning to the fortress. Eleanor had suggestions. You could write about your experience. People love transformation narratives. I haven't transformed. I've just stopped being terrible in one specific way while remaining terrible in others. Perfect. Write that. Honesty sells. I don't want to sell my humiliation. Then what do you want? Good question. What did he want? He'd spent 21 months giving away money and visiting Margaret and trying to be human, and now that project was ending, not because he wanted it to, because money ended, because everything ended eventually, and he had to figure out what came next. What comes after transformation? After the dramatic arc resolves? After you've learned your lesson and made your amends and the newspapers have moved on? Normal life. Boring existence. The long, undramatic work of continuing to be different without it being interesting. I want to disappear, he said. What? I want to stop being Cornelius Grimwald, the candle tax man. Stop being a story. Stop being anyone's lesson. Just be someone. Anyone. Nobody. Eleanor studied him. You can't disappear. You're stuck with yourself. I know, but I can stop performing. Stop trying to redeem myself publicly. Stop making my existence symbolic. Just exist. Work. Pay rent. Light candles. Be boring. That's very healthy. Also impossible. You're famous for being stupid. People will remember. Then I'll move. Leave London. Go somewhere nobody knows about the tax. And do what? I don't know. Accounting? For people who can't afford accountants? Working class people who need help with taxes and budgets and not getting crushed by systems designed to crush them? Eleanor's expression shifted. Interest. Recognition. That's actually good. That's useful. That uses your expertise without perpetuating harm. Is it enough? Nothing's enough, but it's something, and something is all anyone gets. He thought about it. Leaving London, starting over, being nobody, helping people navigate the mathematics of survival, not saving anyone, just making the grinding slightly less grinding, the crushing slightly less crushing, small, unglamorous, necessary work. It appealed to him, not because it was redemptive, because it was honest, because it acknowledged his limits, because it was the right size for what he could actually do, not charity, not performance, just work, useful work, boring work, human work. Where would I go? Anywhere but London, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, somewhere industrial, where working people are, where they need help. When? Whenever your money runs out, 6 months, a year. Use that time to prepare, to learn, to figure out how to actually help instead of just throwing money at problems. It was a plan, not dramatic, not redemptive, just practical. The thing he'd been bad at for 21 months. Practicality, balance, the mathematics of sustainable existence. That night, he told Margaret, expected sadness, got pragmatism. Good, you should go. You think so? You've outgrown London, or London's outgrown you. Either way, you need somewhere new, somewhere you can be nobody. That's healthy. But our Tuesdays will end. Everything ends. That doesn't make them meaningless. Just temporary, like everything else. He felt childish, tears threatening. I'll miss you. I'll miss you too. But missing people is part of being human. You can't avoid it by staying, and you can't stop being human by leaving. You just continue. Different place, same person, same work. That's how it goes. She was right, of course she was right. Margaret was always right about human things, because she'd spent her life being human without the fortress of wealth to hide behind. She understood that everything ends, that love is temporary, that you cherish things while you have them and grieve them when they're gone and continue anyway. Thank you, he said. For what? For being honest, for not asking me to stay, for treating endings like they're normal. They are normal. People leave, people die, people change. You can't control it. You just experience it. That's all. That's life. They sat in silence. Comfortable silence. Last month's silence. The kind you share when you know time is limited and words are insufficient and presence is enough. Over the next months, Cornelius prepared, researched cities. Manchester seemed right, industrial, working class, needed accounting help, far enough from London that nobody would care about a stupid tax from 2 years ago. Close enough to visit occasionally. The right size. He arranged everything with Eleanor. His remaining charitable commitments would continue until money ran out. Then she'd take over. She'd found other donors, other rich people with guilty consciences. The work would continue without him, which proved it had never needed him. He'd just been convenient, temporary, replaceable. That should have hurt. It felt like relief, because if the work continued without him, it was real. Not performance, not ego, just work. Real work that existed independent of his transformation narrative. He sold the townhouse, got less than expected. The market was soft. But it was enough. Added to his remaining funds, he had enough to live modestly for 5 years. Maybe 10 if he was careful. Enough to establish himself in Manchester. Enough to be nobody. Enough to continue. Withers stayed in London. Found work with another household. They said goodbye without drama. 2 men who'd worked together for 15 years. Who'd both changed. Who'd both become slightly more human. Handshake. Good luck, sir. Good luck, Withers. That was enough. His last week in London, he visited places. Not sentimentally, just acknowledging. The bridge where everything cracked. The church where he'd learned to light candles. The school he'd funded. The tenement where children had died because of his efficiency. all of it. Archive of harm and repair and insufficient everything. His last Tuesday with Margaret was quiet. Just tea, just talking, just existing together one final time. Her children made him promise to write. He promised, knowing he probably wouldn't, because writing requires having something to say, and he didn't. He was just continuing, nothing to report. "Are you scared?" Margaret asked. "Terrified." "Good. Fear means you're alive, means you're doing something real. What if I fail?" "You will. Everyone fails. That's not the question. Question is, will you keep trying after you fail? Will you continue?" "Yes." "Then you're fine. Failure that continues becomes life. Success that stops becomes nothing. You're choosing life, that's enough." They hugged. Awkward hug. Neither of them were huggers, but sometimes you need physical confirmation that someone exists. That connection was real. That Tuesday afternoons mattered, even though they were ending. "Goodbye, Cornelius." "Goodbye, Margaret. Don't be a stranger." "I'll try." That's all anyone can do. He left. Walked through Southwark one last time. Through streets he'd come to know. Streets where people lit candles and worked and survived and died and continued. Streets that would continue without him, because streets don't need anyone. They just exist, endlessly, indifferently, beautifully. His last night in London, he stood on the bridge. Same spot as before. Looked at the city. 21 months ago, it had been burning with rebellion. Now it was just existing, just being London. Cold, grey, difficult, itself. He'd thought he would change the city. He'd just embarrassed himself in it, and the city had continued, had taught him, had shown him that you can't control joy, can't tax light, can't calculate humanity, just have to participate, light candles, continue. That's all. That's everything. He lit a candle there on the bridge, one last candle in London, not symbolic, just because it was dark and he had a candle, and why not? Small light, insufficient light, but light nonetheless. Fighting darkness with wax and wick and human stubbornness. The candle burned. The river flowed. And Cornelius Grimwald, former banker, former villain, current nobody in particular, walked away from the city that had broken him and rebuilt him into something smaller and more human. Toward Manchester, toward anonymity, toward the long, boring, necessary work of continuing to be someone slightly less terrible than before. Toward enough. December 1895. 3 years since the candle tax. Manchester, industrial city. Coal smoke and factory noise and people working themselves to death for wages that barely sustained living. Different from London, same problems, different streets, same suffering, different accent, same humanity. Cornelius lived in a small flat above a bakery. 2 rooms, smell of bread and coal, furniture he'd bought used, life he'd built from ordinary components. He'd been here 2 years, long enough to be nobody. Long enough that people didn't know about the candle tax unless he told them, which he didn't. He worked as an accountant, for regular people, factory workers, shopkeepers, people who needed help navigating taxes and debts and the machinery designed to crush anyone without resources. He charged little, sometimes nothing, made enough to survive. Not thrive, survive, which was all most people did. His neighbors knew him as Mr. Grimwald, quiet, competent, helped with numbers, kept to himself. Nobody special, nobody interesting. Just another person trying to get through winter without dying, which was exactly what he'd wanted, to be nobody, to disappear into the mass of ordinary humanity doing ordinary work. He was lonely, not desperately, just chronically. He had no friends, no community, no Margaret visiting on Tuesdays, just work and solitude and the long, quiet evenings of someone who'd chosen invisibility. Sometimes he regretted it, sometimes he appreciated it. Both were true. Christmas was coming, his 3rd in Manchester. The city was preparing, shops decorated, churches planning, families saving for presents and food. The annual ritual of pretending winter wasn't trying to kill you. He'd learned to participate minimally, bought small presents for clients who couldn't afford his services, attended church occasionally, not for God, for community, for the reminder that he existed in relation to others. On December 20th, he received a letter, forwarded from London, from Eleanor. She'd tracked him down despite his attempts at invisibility. The letter was brief. Mr. Grimwald, Margaret is dying. Consumption. She has weeks, maybe days. She's asking for you. Come if you can. Come if you want to say goodbye. She says Tuesday isn't the same without you, Eleanor. Cornelius read the letter 3 times, felt something crack, not breaking, just opening. The careful invisibility he'd built splitting to reveal what he'd been hiding from. Attachment, love, the terrible vulnerability of caring about people who die. He sat in his flat, surrounded by the ordinary life he'd constructed. The safe life, the hidden life, the life where nobody mattered enough to hurt when they left. And he realized he'd made another fortress, different materials, same purpose, keeping pain out by keeping everything out. He packed immediately. 1 bag. Took the train to London. 6 hours of industrial landscape blurring past. 6 hours of remembering Tuesday afternoons, Margaret's bluntness, her children's questions, the way she'd treated him like a person instead of a project, the way she'd let him be human without requiring redemption. Arrived at night, took a cab to Southwark. The streets looked the same, smelled the same, like cabbage and coal smoke and poverty and persistence. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He'd been gone 2 years. Felt like decades. Margaret's building, same stairs, same door. He knocked. The eldest daughter answered. She was 15 now, almost grown, looked tired, looked like someone caring for a dying mother while raising siblings. Looked like Margaret had looked at that age probably. Mr. Grimwald, you came. Eleanor wrote, Mum will be happy, she's not good. The doctor says days, maybe a week. Can I see her? She's sleeping, but you can wait. She'll want to know you're here. He waited, in the small room where they'd had tea, where Margaret had taught him to be human, where her children had asked impossible questions and accepted inadequate answers. The room smelled like sickness now, like the particular rot of lungs failing, like death approaching with bureaucratic efficiency. Margaret's children were there, all 4, sitting quiet, doing the mathematics of grief, calculating life without their mother, coming up short. The youngest was 12 now, old enough to understand, young enough to hope understanding might change things. It wouldn't. Margaret woke at midnight, coughing, terrible coughing. Her daughter helped her sit up, gave her water. The coughing subsided. She looked around, saw Cornelius, smiled. Tired smile, real smile. You came, of course. It's not Tuesday. I'm making an exception. She laughed, small laugh. Cost her. More coughing, but worth it. Always so rigid about schedules. I learned from you. Liar, I taught you chaos. You're naturally rigid. True. He moved closer, sat by her bed. She looked terrible. Grey skin, sunken eyes. The visible evidence of a body giving up. But still Margaret, still sharp, still refusing to pretend death was anything other than what it was. I'm dying, she said. I know. Are you going to tell me I'm not? Give me false hope? No. You're dying. It's terrible. I hate it. Good. Honesty. That's why I like you. You're terrible at comfort but excellent at truth. Is there anything I can do? You can tell me about Manchester, distract me. Give me something other than this room and this death to think about. So he told her. About his flat, his work, his ordinary life. About helping a factory worker navigate debt. About teaching a shopkeeper's daughter arithmetic. About the bread smell and the coal smoke and the blessed anonymity of being nobody. About how boring his life was. About how perfect that felt. Margaret listened, eyes closed, breathing labored, but listening. When he finished, she said, You found it. Found what? Enough. You found enough. Not too much, not too little, just enough. I'm proud of you. I'm not doing anything special. That's the point. Special is exhausting. You're doing necessary, useful, boring. That's better than special. They sat in silence. The comfortable kind. The kind that feels like conversation, even though nobody's talking. Outside, London continued. People sleeping. People working night shifts. People dying in rooms like this. People being born in rooms like this. The endless cycle, the machinery of existence grinding forward regardless of individual suffering. I'm scared, Margaret said. Of dying. Of my children. What happens to them? The youngest is 12. Who takes care of them? Who teaches them? Who makes sure they don't end up like us? Grinding, surviving, never actually living. Cornelius felt something shift, a decision forming. Not planned, not calculated, just obvious. The kind of obvious that comes from finally understanding what matters. I will, he said. What? I'll take care of them, not replace you. Nobody can replace you, but I'll help. Make sure they have food, shelter, education. Make sure they have choices. Make sure grinding doesn't kill them before they figure out how to live. You can't. You're in Manchester. You have work. I'll come back. Not to London, but close enough, or they can come to Manchester. Whatever works, I'll figure it out. Why? Because you were my friend. Because Tuesday afternoons mattered. Because someone has to, and I have resources, and I owe you approximately 1,000 unpaid debts, and this is one I can actually pay. Margaret cried, quiet crying, exhausted crying. Thank you. You're welcome. You're still terrible at comfort. I know. But you're trying. Always. She slept. He stayed. Sitting by her bed, watching her breathe, counting breaths like he used to count candles. Not to control them, just to acknowledge them. Each breath a small victory against death. Each breath temporary. Each breath enough. Her children slept too, eventually. On floors, on chairs, anywhere. The exhausted sleep of people who'd been caring for someone dying, who'd been watching death approach for months, who were so tired of being strong that sleep was rebellion. Cornelius stayed awake. Not because he wanted to, because someone should. Someone should witness. Should sit with dying. Should refuse to let Margaret disappear into darkness alone. Should light metaphorical candles even when the darkness was winning. At dawn, she woke again. Worse. The death rattle starting. The sound of lungs failing. Her children gathered. They knew. You always know. When someone's dying, you know. Tell them, Margaret said. Barely audible. Tell them about the candles. What? The 47 candles. Tell them why it mattered, why we did it, why we lit London on fire. Why? Because they need to know. That joy is worth fighting for. That beauty is necessary. That you light candles even when it's stupid, even when it's wasteful, even when someone tries to tax them. You light them anyway, tell them, so he told them. Margaret's children gathered around. He told them about the candle tax, about their mother lighting 47 candles, about London burning with rebellion, about learning that efficiency isn't virtue, about transformation and failure and the long work of becoming slightly less terrible. They listened, crying, but listening. And when he finished, the youngest asked, "Did the candles work?" "What do you mean? Did they save anything? Did they fix anything?" Cornelius looked at Margaret, her breathing shallow, her time measured in minutes now, and he understood the answer. "They saved me," he said. "Your mother's 47 candles broke my fortress, taught me that light matters more than logic, that joy is non-negotiable, that humans need beauty to survive. I'd be dead without those candles, not physically, but actually, inside, where it matters. She saved me, with wax and wick and magnificent spite." Margaret smiled, small smile, last smile. "Good answer. Thank you. Take care of them." "I will. Promise." "I promise." "Good." She closed her eyes. breathed 3 more times. Each breath smaller, each breath harder, each breath a fight against the inevitable. And then she stopped breathing, stopped fighting, stopped being Margaret Whitmore, seamstress, mother, lighter of 47 candles, teacher of humanity to accountants who'd forgotten how. Her children cried, loud crying, the crying that comes when someone irreplaceable leaves, when the world becomes smaller. When you realize that love is just setting yourself up for loss, but you do it anyway because the alternative is worse. Cornelius didn't cry, not because he didn't feel it, because he was holding space, being witness, being the adult who stays steady when everything else collapses, being the thing Margaret had needed him to be, reliable, present, human. Later there would be arrangements, funeral planning, legal matters, the bureaucracy of death. But right now, there was just sitting. Just being with the empty body that used to be his friend. Just acknowledging that something important had ended. At noon, he stood up. Told Margaret's children he'd return tomorrow. Walked out into London. Into December, cold. Into the city that had taught him everything while he thought he was teaching it. He walked to the bridge. His bridge. Where everything had cracked. Where he'd stood 3 years ago watching a city burn with candles. Where he'd felt wonder for the first time in decades. Where he'd started becoming human instead of calculator. He had one candle. Always carried one now. Habit from the giveaway. From learning that darkness happens and you need light. He lit it. There on the bridge. In daylight. Completely unnecessary. Completely wasteful. Completely right. The candle burned. Traffic passed. People walked by, confused by a man lighting candles in daytime. He didn't care. This wasn't for them. This was for Margaret. For the woman who taught him that waste is sometimes wisdom. That efficiency kills joy. That you light candles not because it makes sense, but because darkness is terrible and light is hope, and that's enough. The wind blew the candle out. He relit it. It blew out again. He relit it again, stubborn, persistent, refusing to let darkness win, fighting physics with human stubbornness, fighting death with wax, fighting meaninglessness with meaning he created by insisting it existed. The candle stayed lit, finally, burned for 10 minutes, then died naturally. Wax consumed, wick exhausted, light ending because light always ends, but having existed, having fought, having mattered for however long it lasted. Cornelius stood on the bridge, holding an extinguished candle, feeling the weight of loss, feeling the gratitude of having known someone worth losing, feeling the terrible privilege of being alive to mourn the dead. And he understood something final. Something that all his mathematics and all his charity and all his transformation had been approaching. You don't light candles to defeat darkness. You light them to acknowledge that darkness exists and you refuse to surrender to it. You light them knowing they'll go out, knowing wax runs out, knowing everything ends. You light them anyway, because that's what humans do. We fight losing battles. We love mortal beings. We create temporary beauty. We light candles against infinite darkness. Not because it works, because it's necessary, because the alternative is accepting darkness. And darkness isn't acceptable. Margaret had lit 47 candles, had lived 43 years, had raised 4 children, had befriended a broken banker, had taught him humanity, had died of consumption in a Southwark tenement, had mattered more than all the money he'd ever made. That was the final calculation. The only one that mattered. Not wealth, not redemption, not transformation. Just connection. Just the stubborn insistence that some people matter. That some lights burn bright enough to illuminate everything else. That some Tuesday afternoons are worth more than all the Tuesdays that came before or after. Cornelius put the dead candle in his pocket, walked off the bridge, into London, into the work of keeping promises, into the long, unglamorous task of raising children who weren't his, into the beautiful burden of honoring the dead by helping the living, into enough, into everything, into the only mathematics that mattered. Love minus loss equals continuation, and continuation was enough. December 1910. 18 years later, Manchester. Cornelius Thaddeus Grimwald was 66 years old, grey hair, stooped posture, the visible evidence of time passing, of bodies aging, of everything moving toward the same conclusion Margaret had reached 15 years earlier. He lived in the same flat above the bakery, still did accounting, mostly for free now. He had a small pension from investments Eleanor had insisted he keep. Enough to survive, not thrive, survive, which was all most people did, which was enough. Margaret's children were grown. The eldest was 33, married, had children of her own. The second was 30, working as a teacher. The third was 28, a shopkeeper. The youngest was 27, a clerk. All of them alive, all of them surviving, all of them carrying Margaret's stubbornness and Cornelius's mathematics. Good combination. They visited occasionally, brought grandchildren, told him about their lives. He listened, asked questions, played the role of uncle, grandfather, friend, the role Margaret had assigned him when she died, the role he'd accepted because someone had to, and he'd promised. He was tired, not dying, just tired. The exhaustion that comes from being alive for 66 years in a world that grinds everyone down eventually. The exhaustion that comes from helping people for 2 decades, knowing you're not fixing anything, just making the grinding slightly less grinding. But he wasn't unhappy. Happiness was too ambitious. But he wasn't unhappy. He'd found something better than happiness. Purpose, small purpose, unglamorous purpose, the purpose of continuing to be useful, of helping with taxes and budgets and the mathematics of survival, of being the person who explains systems to people being crushed by them. Christmas was coming, his 18th in Manchester. The city prepared as always, shops, churches, families, the annual ritual. He participated minimally, bought small presents, attended church, lit candles, the same pattern. Comfortable, sustainable. Enough. On December 20th, he received a letter from London, from someone he didn't know, a young woman. The letter explained she was researching the candle tax, writing a thesis about taxation and public rebellion. She'd found records, newspaper articles, his published letters, and she wanted to interview him, to ask about what happened, to understand the story. Cornelius almost threw the letter away. He'd spent 18 years being nobody, didn't want to resurrect the candle tax, didn't want to be a story again, didn't want his stupid mistake to become historical analysis, just wanted to continue being Mr. Grimwald, the accountant above the bakery who helped with numbers. But something made him respond. Not ego, curiosity. What did people remember? What had the stupid tax become in collective memory? Had it been simplified, romanticized, turned into a neat lesson about redemption when the reality had been messy and insufficient? He wrote back. Brief letter. Said she could visit. Gave his address. Said he'd tell her the truth, but she probably wouldn't like it because the truth was complicated and unsatisfying, and people preferred simple stories. She arrived December 23rd. Young, 25 maybe. Enthusiastic, the kind of enthusiasm that comes from not yet understanding how complicated everything is. She had questions prepared, pages of questions, about the tax, about the rebellion, about his transformation. They sat in his small flat, tea on the table, bread from the bakery below, the smell of coal smoke and winter. He answered her questions honestly, told her about his childhood, about building the fortress, about trying to tax Christmas, about London burning, about Margaret, about the long unglamorous work of becoming slightly less terrible. She took notes, excited notes, already forming her thesis, already fitting him into a narrative. Cornelius could see it happening, the messy reality being shaped into story, the complicated human becoming simple character, the transformation becoming redemption. So you learned your lesson, she said. You realized that joy can't be taxed, that efficiency isn't everything, that humanity matters more than calculation. No. No? I didn't learn a lesson. Lessons are things you learn once and then know forever. I just made different mistakes, replaced calculation with charity, replaced one fortress with another. eventually learned that there's no right answer, just continuing, just trying to do less harm, just lighting candles when it's dark. She looked confused. But you transformed. You went from villain to... What? Hero? Nobody. I went from villain to nobody. That's not transformation. That's just erosion. Time wearing away the sharp edges, making me smaller, more human, less special. That's not a lesson, that's just aging. But you help people now, you do good work. I do necessary work, not good. Necessary. I help people with taxes because I'm good at mathematics and they're not. That's not heroism. That's just using skills I have. That's what everyone does. Or should do. That's normal. But the candle tax was stupid. Still is. I was wrong. London was right. That's not transformation. That's just being corrected, publicly, humiliatingly. And instead of doubling down, I accepted it. That's not growth. That's just not being an idiot twice in the same way. The woman's thesis was crumbling. He could see it. She'd wanted a redemption narrative, a villain who learned and changed and became good, a neat arc, a satisfying story, and he was giving her mess, complexity, the unsatisfying truth that people don't transform, they just adjust. That redemption isn't real, just different mistakes, that stories lie and life is complicated and nothing ever resolves cleanly. So, what should I write? She asked. The truth, that the candle tax was stupid, that it accidentally politicized joy, that London rebelled not because they were wise but because they were stubborn, that I gave away money not because I was redeemed but because I was scared, that Margaret taught me humanity by being blunt and honest and refusing to let me perform transformation, that I moved to Manchester to be nobody, that I've spent 18 years helping people with arithmetic. That's it. That's the story. It's boring. Write it anyway. She left, disappointed probably. Her thesis ruined by reality, her neat narrative complicated by honesty. But maybe that was necessary. Maybe the lesson of the candle tax wasn't transformation. Maybe it was that transformation narratives lie, that people are complicated, that villains don't become heroes, they just become different villains, or if they're lucky, boring people doing necessary work. That night, Cornelius couldn't sleep, thinking about the interview, about stories, about how culture needs redemption narratives because without them, what's the point? If people can't change, why try? But people don't change. Not really. They just become different versions of themselves. Less terrible versions, hopefully, but still themselves, still carrying everything they've ever done, still living with harm they can't undo. He got up, 3 in the morning, lit a candle, just one. Habit now. When he couldn't sleep, he lit candles. Not symbolically, just because darkness was terrible and light helped, and sometimes that was enough. Sitting in that single candle's light, Cornelius thought about legacy, about what remains. He'd given away £2 million, helped hundreds of people, raised Margaret's children, done thousands of tax returns, lived 18 years in Manchester being useful. And what remained? Nothing. Nothing dramatic. No monuments. No lasting change. The systems he'd helped build still crushed people. The inequality he'd profited from still existed. The harm he'd caused couldn't be undone. All his work, all his charity and help and transformation added up to small temporary relief for specific people. Nothing structural. Nothing permanent. Nothing that would survive him. And that was fine, that was appropriate. That was the truth the woman's thesis needed but probably wouldn't include. Redemption isn't real. You don't balance ledgers. You don't undo harm. You just stop doing it and do something else instead. And that something else is usually small, usually insufficient, usually forgotten. But you do it anyway, because what else is there? You light candles. You help with taxes. You raise children who aren't yours. You continue. Not because it fixes anything, because continuing is the point. Because the alternative is giving up, and giving up isn't acceptable. The candle burned. He watched it, remembering Margaret's 47 candles, remembering London burning, remembering the moment his fortress cracked, remembering everything that had led to sitting alone in Manchester at 66, lighting candles at 3 in the morning, accepting that his life had been small and complicated and insufficient and enough. Outside, Manchester slept. Inside, an old man sat with memories, and in the space between memory and present, Cornelius understood the final lesson of the candle tax. There is no lesson, just experience, just continuing. Just the long, unglamorous work of being human in a world that makes being human nearly impossible. Just lighting candles against darkness, knowing they'll go out. Just helping people knowing it's not enough. Just loving people knowing they'll die. Just continuing knowing everything ends. That's not redemption. That's just life. And life is enough. Has to be enough. Because it's all anyone gets. The candle burned lower. He thought about extinguishing it, decided to let it burn out naturally. Waste the wax, be inefficient, honor Margaret's memory by refusing to optimize everything, by letting things burn until they're done instead of calculating their exact utility. The candle burned, and burned, and finally, hours later, as dawn approached, it guttered, flickered, died, leaving darkness, leaving silence. Leaving an old man alone in Manchester with nothing but memories and the knowledge that he'd done what he could, and it hadn't been enough, and that was okay because nothing was ever enough, and enough was still worth pursuing. He sat in the dark, didn't light another candle, just sat, comfortable with darkness, comfortable with endings, comfortable with the fact that everything, candles, lives, stories, legacies, burns out eventually. And that's not tragedy. That's just physics. Just time. Just the way things are. When dawn came, pale and cold through his window, Cornelius stood, made tea, started his day. Another ordinary day. Another day of helping people with arithmetic. Another day of continuing to be useful. Another day of being nobody special doing necessary work. The candle tax was 28 years behind him. Margaret had been dead for 15 years. His fortress had fallen decades ago. And what remained? Just him, just an old accountant in Manchester. Just a person who'd made terrible mistakes and tried to make smaller mistakes afterward. Just someone who lit candles when it was dark. Just someone who continued. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the only legacy worth leaving. Evidence that someone tried. Evidence that continuing is possible. Evidence that you can be terrible and become slightly less terrible, and that's progress. And progress is enough. Outside, Manchester woke up. People going to work. Children going to school. The machinery of existence grinding forward. And Cornelius Thaddeus Grimwald, former banker, former villain, former nobody, current nobody, prepared to join them, to continue, to help, to light candles, to do necessary work, to be human, to be enough, until he wasn't anymore, until his candle burned out too, until he joined Margaret in darkness, until someone else lit candles and continued and proved that the project of being human survives individual humans. That light persists even when specific flames die. That continuation is collective, that we're all just candles, temporary, fragile, but burning, fighting darkness with our brief light, mattering for however long we last. The bread smell from below, the coal smoke outside, the tea in his cup, the mathematical problems waiting on his desk, the ordinary components of an ordinary life, of a life that had tried to be special and failed and discovered that failure was the point. That ordinary was the achievement. That enough was everything. Cornelius finished his tea, opened his door, walked downstairs, into Manchester, into December, into his work, into the continuation of being human, into enough. The last candle had burned out. But somewhere in London, in Manchester, in every city where people fought darkness, someone was lighting another, and another, and another, forever, stubbornly, beautifully, wastefully, necessarily, because that's what humans do. We light candles, we continue, we fight darkness with fire. We refuse to accept that efficiency is virtue, or calculation is wisdom, or darkness is inevitable. We light candles, and that's enough, and enough is everything.